a bit more time to report back on that, if I may. I think those were the questions. Back on that, if I may.
The two parcels are marked out, the MR and community land, or it's both the intent and use both pieces?
That's what this map is suggesting. I need to show, I need to figure out exactly what it is saying. Previously, we had proposed that rezoning, and so I need to understand exactly where the reference is in the bylaw. So I will report back on that.
You guys realize that was in a September 12th release? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, yeah, after the meeting, once there's discussion and decision on the proposed land use bylaw changes, we can talk if you still have questions afterwards.
I will contact you.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public with questions?
My name's Ken Stannard, and I just have a question in regards to development for dog parks, specifically Spring Creek. And I just want to bring to light and make sure that council is aware that there is a new path that's been put in the proposed location. Pedestrian path going from Policeman's Creek to CPR property.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Yes?
Hi, Marianne Allen. I was just hoping either council or planning could answer the question how the proposed, recently even edited land use bylaw amendments that I just got to look at today are actually going to promote affordable housing and accessory dwellings based on the following 2 points. One, how does restricting all cars from front yards and you know, the initiative to push them all in the backyards allow green space for the main house and the accessory dwelling and not turn it into parking lots with no mature trees? And also, how does the additional restrictions on dormers encourage accessory dwellings when the current regulations, we can't even get any approved? And these are more restrictive. Thank you.
And as I suggested, Ms. Bosch, the discussion that'll ensue and decision will probably help inform your questions. Otherwise, we can talk after the meeting. Thank you. If there's no further questions from the public, I'll call the meeting to order. Are there any changes, additions to the agenda? Seeing none, I'll move the agenda be approved as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. There are no delegations this evening. Looking then to the minutes of the September 12th public hearing. Are there errors or omissions? Seeing none, I'll move the minutes be adopted as... Whoop. Cottle, Ms. Hyde.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. In the public hearing minutes, there's one correction to be made under public submissions. If you look at the in favor list, Jake Pryor has written in to say that his submission should be in the opposed section. So we'll make that adjustment to the minutes.
Okay. Are there any other errors or omissions in the those minutes? Seeing none, I'll move they be adopted as amended. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Looking then to the minutes of the September 19th regular meeting of council. Are there errors or omissions? Councillor Krausert.
Thank you, Your Worship. Under the delegation from Mr. McClure, it says a decision report will be presented at the October 3rd regular meeting. Of course, that's not our regular process, and that's not what happened, so that probably should be removed from the minutes.
Where are you in the minutes?
It's on the top of the second page of those minutes. It says a decision report will be presented at the October 3rd, 2017 regular meeting.
Right.
Of course, that's not our practice, nor is that what happened. So.
Right. Any other errors or omissions? Seeing none, I'll move those minutes be adopted as amended. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on to item D1, business arising from the minutes. This in regards to the delegation that appeared recently at council from the chamber looking for support for their Innovate Canmore project. Councillors will recall that discussion, I'm sure. There is no report from council. I thought it would be easiest just simply put the motion on the table and have a discussion through that process and make a decision. Councillor Russell?
Can I ask why there's no report, Your Worship, please?
Wasn't felt it was necessary. It's a fairly straightforward request.
Okay. I have a couple of questions, but
So with that, I will then move that council provide support to the Bow Valley Chamber of Commerce's Innovate Canmore project as follows. In-kind access to the SuperNet for the pilot program and $25,000 to fund an initial feasibility study focusing on municipal economic development diversification funded from the Economic Development Reserve. Councillor Krausert, you wanted to speak to that motion?
I was actually just going to be asking a question about the funded from the Economic Development Reserve. I'm glad it's there because it's not on our agenda. I was just wondering this would be from 2018 reserve and what our balance is on that. Okay. I don't think we've allocated anything from the 2018 funds.
There would be.
So it would be the full amount. I just wanted to have that verified.
It'll take me a minute to find. I am looking to see how much is left in 17, and right now we have nothing allocated for 2018, so you're right, it would be the full amount available.
Right. And I know we had some come back to us from CBT from the 2017 amounts, or was that 2016? Anyway, I would just want to have that verification, please.
If there are other questions, you might want to proceed, and I will let you know once I have this number.
Councillor Russell?
thank you, Your Worship. What's involved with the in-kind access to SuperNet here? Is there a cost? Is there logistics?
No, as was reported or spoken to by the delegation, it's essentially a line of sight to the town's equipment on top of elevation place. As long as there's line of sight, then Innovate Canmore can get access to the SuperNet through that.
Will we be providing them with hardware or?
No.
So just password access and off they go?
That's my understanding. Mr. Fark?
So our understanding is that there is no additional cost to the town. The access to the SuperNet will be within our allocated bandwidth and can be accessed from the existing facilities.
Thank you.
So the only cost to the town from this motion would be the funding from the Economic Development Reserve of $25,000, which I'll speak to the motion while we wait for that answer, but I'll be prepared to support the motion quite happily. We've been talking for years about doing what we can to diversify our economy and to build sectors other than the tourism sector to be stronger parts of our town economy. And the research-based or knowledge-based sector was identified years ago. In fact, it's one of the sectors that was spoken to in the 2010 economic development plan. But there hasn't been very little that has happened since 2010 on that sector. The intent of the Economic Development Reserve is to fund projects like this. Currently there's very little being funded out of the Economic Development Reserve other than the grant that we set up this past year. So unless there's some other discussion that would inform me otherwise, I will support the motion to Did you have that yet? Councillor Sanford?
Thank you. I just had another question for Mr. Fark, since he answered the previous one on the infrastructure. Is anybody else sharing that SuperNet connection in the Elevation Place?
To my understanding, no. It is simply town facility.
Okay, I just wanted to verify that the Canmore Public Library is on its own SuperNet connection? So it's separated in the building?
That is correct, yes.
Okay,
I'm
all right.
looking to Mr. Wingham back in the back there to assist me, and he is nodding his head in the affirmative.
That's how I thought it was, but that was a few years ago, so I just want to verify that.
Councillor McCallum?
I just had a question through the chair to administration as well with regards to this. Would this not normally be something that we would RFP for, especially if there was interest in there in the community and actually somebody wanting to take on this work? Would it not be something that we would generally RFP for?
That is certainly a process that is potentially available. In this particular case, a group has come forward, the chamber, with an interest in pursuing this type of work. So council has in the past provided funding for initiatives in this manner, but also RFPing. If the town decided that of its own initiative it wished to understand this information, then that would be also a valid means of going about it.
And an economic development officer, whether in-house or out-of-house, is going to be something that's explored in 2018, correct?
So based on the direction of council, the intent is administration will bring forward a recommendation for an economic development officer for 2018, yes.
And so this could be something that they drive?
This could be within the scope of their work also.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Comfort?
Do we know how long this project will take?
That was in the presentation.
I couldn't recall.
Yeah. Phase one, I think they're already operating in the building above the sports expert, whichever it is. And I think it's a 2-year program until phase two, 1 or 2 year. And then phase two, or I should say they're moving. The presentation delegation indicated they had option to lease the space in the new commercial building that's going to be built on Bow Valley Trail, which also has line of sight to Elevation Place. So the Innovate Canmore would be operating out of either of those sites until ultimately the full facility is built one day. Councillor Crossett.
Your worship. Subject to that information being received, I very much support this initiative for the reasons that you stated, and it is aligned with our economic development reserve, and it does go to our goal of economic diversification. All of that said, I'm wondering if it might be prudent to table this to just down the agenda a little bit until, so that the administration can find that and we can move on to the next item.
Yeah, I think that's probably what we should be doing. So let's table this motion until after F1 and see where we're at then. Tabling motion, need a vote?
Yes.
Those in favor of tabling the motion? In favor? Opposed? Motion is carried. Then we will move on to item F1, Bylaw 2017-29, the 2017 Land Use Bylaw Update. Mr. Prevost.
Good evening, Council. I'm Lee Prevost, and tonight I'm representing the town's planning department. We want to present Bylaw 2017-29 for second reading. The focus of tonight's presentation is to highlight the changes that we've made to the amendments that were presented at first reading back in August. Changes made in response to feedback that we've received from the public and industry. Our direction for these bylaw changes comes from the new municipal development plan, which was a 2-year process to blueprint a vision for Canmore's development over the next 10 years. Amongst others, the vision prominently highlighted goals of supporting a diverse population by encouraging a variety of housing options, being a leader in social, economic, and environmental issues, and recognizing that our community is evolving, meet the needs of our changing population by evolving the forms of development that are supported in Canmore. These guiding principles are the catalyst behind our LUB changes, in particular those related to green building regulations and accessory dwelling units, which are the first 2 schedules highlighted in the report. The last 2 schedules propose changes to the specific bylaw clauses that have proven ambiguous in the past and are intended to better align the bylaw with the town's vision through clarification of sections that have been challenging to interpret, and by ensuring that current implementation practices are explicit in the clauses. As mentioned at first reading, employee housing and Steep Creek guidelines were originally targeted as part of this update, but were held back to provide us the opportunity to refine those concepts and gain further public consultation on the potential impacts. In addition to last month's public hearing, we had 6 other formal engagement activities over the last 2 months in an effort to understand how these proposed changes might impact members of our community. The feedback we've received has been integral to the many changes that we've made to those proposals, and those are the changes we'll go over tonight. Under the environmental stewardship section, the MDP provides specific guidance that commits Canmore to being a leader in sustainable practices that protect the environment. One of those practices centers around the energy efficiency of buildings. Canmore's regulations are broken down into 2 groups, those that address small-scale residential and those that address larger-scale residential, commercial, industrial, and institutional projects. A year ago, Alberta introduced an updated building code, which for the first time included an energy code for housing, intended to promote a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and lower the overall demand for energy resources. It did so by introducing consumption targets based upon improvements to building envelopes, lighting, heating and cooling, and domestic hot water. To identify the appropriate energy consumption targets, the Energy Code uses Canada's EnerGuide program as a basis to determine how much energy a house built specifically to meet the building code should consume. Canmore's Green Building Program has always required developments to exceed the minimum standards for energy consumption, and our proposal in August was to require new residential housing to consume 10% less energy than those EnerGuide targets. What we heard from industry is that since they've been exceeding the minimum standards for many years now, there was some confidence that these new measures were feasible. And they showed support for the inclusion of incentives and penalties to encourage builders to meet this target. Because of the support we received for the original proposal, no changes are being made to the first reading amendments. Average incentives and penalties will remain in the range of $300 to $1,200 per house, with fees being calculated as a percentage of a construction cost, so they may vary slightly from these numbers. We're going to ladder incentives and penalties to ensure that we recognize performance that ends up being 10%, 20%, or 30% better or worse than the model EnerGuide target. And to ensure the regulations are actually encouraging better green building performance, the industry and the town have agreed to review these incentives and penalties in about a year and make some further changes if required. Until a year ago, the 1994 Model National Energy Code for Buildings was the most current one endorsed by the province of Alberta. Our green building program has required large-scale residential, commercial, industrial, and institutional projects to exceed that 1994 energy code by 25%. At first reading, we proposed to maintain that requirement for projects to exceed the energy code by 25%, but we proposed to switch to the province's newly adopted 2011 energy code, which was had more stringent requirements that are intended to significantly reduce energy consumption by big buildings, and in doing so, reduce the output of greenhouse gas emissions. We heard from stakeholders that there was still support for Canmore regulations to continue to promote leadership in green building, that there's continued support for meaningful incentives and penalties, but that there's concerns that the cost to achieve and ultimately exceed the new targets are difficult to quantify right now, as too few developments have been completed since the adoption of the new energy code. Because of that concern, and through collaborative work with BODA, a new proposal's been identified that provides developers with 3 options. The first is to simply meet the standards of the new 2011 Energy Code. There'd be no incentives or penalties for either exceeding or missing the targets. The second option would be to meet the requirements of the new, more strict 2015 Energy Code, which is more common in other parts of Canada but hasn't yet been adopted by Alberta. Consumption targets for the 2015 code are about 12% better than the current code. And to incent this level of performance, variances would be considered in areas such as building height, setbacks, lot coverage, density, and parking. Variances in excess of those that are typically available. The last option would require these larger developments to exceed the 2015 Energy Code, which would achieve meaningful improvements to energy consumption over today. In addition to the potential variances outlined for option 2, developers that would exceed the 2015 targets would be eligible for a noticeable reduction in development securities. For both the second and third options, failure to meet the 2011 or 2015 energy codes, respectively, would result in forfeiting an escalating amount of performance securities, anywhere from 10% to the full 100%, depending on the severity of the diminished level of performance. Similar to the support we received for small-scale residential, we also heard support for revisiting the targets for larger developments after the town and industry have more information about the impacts from implementing these new requirements. The second schedule, which we receive feedback on, is accessory dwelling units, which are also known as secondary suites, garden suites, and garage suites. The MDP identifies affordable housing as the most complex and challenging issue facing Canmore. And last year's Town Budgets and Businesses Plan set out a #1 priority of increasing Canmore's stock of affordable housing. These 2 documents clearly outline goals to encourage the range of housing types that will lead to an inclusive community, to integrate affordable housing throughout the town, but while removing barriers that might hinder new projects. They also identify areas within walking distance of the town center, commercial and mixed-use districts, and sites close to transit stops as being specifically attractive for new units. Since 1998, accessory dwelling units have been permitted in many new residential subdivisions. In 2012, districts allowing secondary suites were expanded to include some established residential areas. But these changes have not resulted in very many new suites, with only 17 being completed in the last 5 years, an average of 3 per year. In an effort to spur new development, we introduced updates to development permit requirements in order to streamline the approvals process. We qualified the requirements for additional parking as a way to expand the number of sites that are available for affordable housing development. And we introduced stricter design controls intended to minimize the potential for negative impacts to neighboring properties. And we'll go over each one of these in detail. As development permits are currently not required for single-family and duplex residents that require no variances, at first reading, we proposed to remove the development permit requirement for secondary suites that are included within those projects. As the suite would be fully contained within the primary dwelling, there would be no additional impacts to viewscapes, building height, massing, or lot coverage, and therefore couldn't prove to negatively impact neighboring properties. Any application requesting a variance would still require a development permit, as would all applications for detached garden and garage suites. About 80% of the responses we had were in favor of this amendment, so we aren't proposing to make any further changes. Following recommendations from the MDP and CCHC's 2015 accessory dwelling unit study that prioritized housing opportunities for people over parking opportunities for vehicles, we proposed relaxing the requirement to add a third parking stall to a site in areas that were within 1 kilometer of the town center or 450 meters of a transit stop. We made these proposals because a third parking stall is considered a significant barrier to accessory suite development because of restrictions in place that limit the percentage of development that can occur on a site, in most cases 40% of the lot area. That restriction is well meeting, and it's intended to ensure that sufficient front and rear setbacks exist, that side yards remain undeveloped, and to allow room for landscaping that enhances the quality of a development. In most cases, adding a third parking stall would require a variance to some of those requirements, which could potentially be a negative impact to the design character of a neighborhood. As well, the town's been providing increasingly more alternative modes of transportation, which have traditionally led to changes in vehicle use patterns in other municipalities and have the potential to reduce street parking demand over the long term. We received a fairly even mix of support and opposition to relaxing parking requirements.
Mr. Prevost, I just have one question.
Sure.
On that point, when you talk about an even mix of support and opposition, what sort of, how many people are you talking about? Have we heard from? And what's the?
Colin.
So those that responded to the survey, there were 36 respondents on parking, 26 of which supported the change, the proposed relaxation. Yeah. However, at the public hearing, we did hear more negative responses at that hearing. Right. So it's a fairly even mix.
Thank you. Sorry.
I think it's fair to say that we didn't receive sufficient support or opposition enough to provide a definitively clear direction on how to approach that. So what we're proposing is to add 2 conditions that, while allowing parking relaxations in some areas, would mitigate the risk that relaxations might lead to parking shortages on a street. The first condition would be to ensure that applications for new accessory dwelling units already satisfy the existing parking requirements to have 2 off-street stalls for the primary dwelling unit. And the second would be to restrict the number of accessory dwelling units to a maximum of 35% of the lots in a given block.
And how did you come up with 35%?
It's yeah. So essentially, we looked at numerous other municipalities that have been more successful at implementing accessory dwelling units. 35% is a fairly common number. It's actually a pretty big range, but the areas that have been proven successful use 35% as a number. It's also small enough to ensure that we aren't introducing a dramatic amount of new cars or suites to any block in Canmore.
Thank you.
Also, based on some of those best practices from other municipalities, we introduced a series of new design controls. They included the option for larger 2-bedroom suites to be possible on very large lots, new site coverage requirements to allow for more usable space, and roof and eave height limitations for 1.5-story suites to limit them appearing to be 2 stories high. We also removed the requirement for both street and laneway access as a condition of application. We received, obviously, plenty of feedback about accessory dwelling units. We found that about 70% of respondents had a positive perception towards accessory suites, and there was a consistent theme that suites provide income flexibility that support families, and they provide much-needed rental options for Canmore. Most respondents agreed that design elements need to be respectful of their impacts to adjacent neighbors. There was concern that site coverage changes might require relaxations to landscaping and setback requirements, things that help foster design integrity in a community. There was support to ensure that proposed design changes would be thoroughly modeled before implementation so that we can identify any unintended consequences. There was support that larger suites would have related higher construction costs, which could lead to higher, less affordable rents in order to recapture the original capital investment. And lastly, we heard concerns around the potential for accessory suites to be illegally used as home businesses or vacation rentals. Because of all of the comments we received, we've proposed a number of changes. Because affordable housing is our #1 goal with accessory dwelling units, we've removed the option for larger 75 square meter suites on large lots, as we recognize that they are less likely to be rented at an affordable rate. We've also removed changes to dormer size and location, as well as lot coverages, pending what we learn at co-design exercises, which we want to schedule with the local design industry. We are introducing maximum detached suite eave and dormer heights to prevent the appearance of suites being seen as 2 stories high. And we will explicitly prohibit home occupation licenses and bed and breakfast uses in accessory dwelling units to minimize the risks of negative impacts to the surrounding communities.
Councillor Russell?
Did you just confuse me with what you said there? You're going to you're going to restrict home occupations and bed and breakfast in places that have a basement suite. Am I understanding that correctly?
For all accessory dwelling units, yes.
For all accessory dwelling, but they could still have one in the main unit, but not, like, it seems like you're saying they could be a bed and breakfast in the accessory unit?
The concern was not to have a bed and breakfast in the accessory dwelling unit, and I'm not clear, actually, I'm sorry, I have to apologize. I don't think that restricts bed and breakfast from the primary unit necessarily.
That's just it's just very confusing. My vision of an accessory suite is something small.
Yes.
I don't know that I would visualize someone coming to book a bed and breakfast in a basement suite.
So we don't want the occupant of a bed and breakfast an occupant of a suite to be able to operate a bed and breakfast. It would be inappropriate from a size perspective and adds to additional other site constraints.
Fair enough.
And the same issue and the home occupation would be the class 2 occupation. So the class 1 would be still permitted. That's records and books or that sort of thing. As well as continuing the restriction for visitor common tourist home.
Thank you.
Just a couple other questions here. Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Mr. Provost, you talked about not needing a development permit for the suites. Is there a control mechanism if you don't have a development permit? Like what happens if a whole bunch of them go in, which would be a good thing, but there needs to be some control mechanisms, I think, to make sure that there's not too many in one specific area or other ways to.
Right. The control mechanism available would be the building code, but also we're intending to introduce that restriction so that only 35% of lots on a given block could have accessory suites, of which a basement suite would be one of the ones counted.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Cressert.
My question was answered, thank you.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thanks, Mr. Prevost. I'm still not clear on how you're going to regulate it if there's no development permit. So
Excuse me.
How are we going to know if it's 35% in one? And I'm not sure what you're calling a block.
Okay, I can answer those questions. Okay. It'll be easily identified from the building permit because you would have a suited unit in the basement, which is subject to the building code requirements around separate heating and ventilation, fire safety controls, we would see a kitchen in there on the development, so we would be able to identify it as a secondary suite, and then it would count towards that count. For a block, the simplest definition we can come up with is just by address. So the entire 800 block of 13th Street, for instance, would be one block. So both sides of the street, anything with an 8 as the starting number on 13th Street, that would be considered a block, if that helps.
Mr. Sanford?
Thank you, that's good.
Yep, sure. The third schedule outlines the proposed omnibus changes to the land use bylaw, with a focus on ensuring the bylaw is easy to understand, that our current practices when interpreting the bylaw are explicit in the clauses. We want to be consistent in the terms we use. We want to remove clauses that are duplicated and correct errors that we've uncovered. And for these proposed changes, 3 specific areas receive the bulk of the feedback from stakeholders, so we'll go over those really quickly. The MDP recognizes that Canmore's proximity to undeveloped wilderness areas exposes some areas of town to greater risk from wildfire. While administration has been requesting additional wildfire risk assessments for several years, the proposed changes are intended to require more stringent fire-smart strategies to be implemented at the approval stage, in an effort to reduce the chance that fire spreads via close proximity to landscaping or by combustible exterior building materials. Some concern was raised about the potential for construction costs to be increased, but we feel mitigating against the catastrophic damage that can occur from wildfire takes precedent, and so no changes are proposed to those originally identified. With experience from the 2013 flood, the MDP directs the use of provincial flood mapping to identify areas of higher risk during 1 in 100 flood events. Our proposed changes formalize where the high floodwater districts are located, and they embed design requirements that are intended to mitigate against damage to people and property in these emergency situations. The changes also clearly align the land use bylaw at-risk flood locations with the provincial flood mapping. When provincial flood mapping ultimately gets updated, we would come back and update our mapping at that time. Similar to the fire safety changes, there was some concern that this would have the potential to raise construction costs, but we're still recommending these changes as critical to lowering the risk during these extreme water events. Responding to requests from communities that current zoning was not restrictive enough to prevent new unsupported development from occurring on what is mostly park and playground space, and to better reflect the intended long-term uses on these sites, we're proposing to rezone 9 sites to one of Environment District, Public Use District, or Wildlands Conservation District. In all cases, these new districts significantly restrict the uses that can occur on the sites, while allowing the currently supported use to continue. Outside of sites located in the Peaks of Grassy community, we've heard mostly support for the changes. For the Peaks area, we've continually heard concern that the proposed changes could be used as a backdoor to allow new development to occur on the sites, so I'll be clear. No new development proposals have been submitted to the town for sites in Peaks of Grassy, or any of them, and none are being considered for any of these sites. Unfortunately, during the notification period, 2 lots in Peaks of Grassy proposed to be changed from Environment District to Wildlands Conservation District were accidentally identified as Environmental District and Wildlife Conservation District. To ensure clarity, we're going to pull all 6 sites from the Peaks of Grassy area from the redistricting, pending re-notification and a future public process. The last schedule outlines proposed formatting changes to the land use bylaw that are intended to rearrange the sections to better reflect the order in which development typically occurs and to allow room for expansion or removal of clauses as the bylaw evolves over time. We received no feedback related to this proposal, and so no further changes are being recommended. This bylaw is intended to better align with the municipal development plan's foundational values of sustainability, diversity, and connectedness. It includes significant changes to the proposals that were put forward at first reading, and it reflects the feedback we've received during multiple stakeholder events, as well as numerous email and phone call submissions. Our recommendation is that Council give second and third reading to Bylaw 2017-29, the 2017 Land Use Bylaw Update. As part of the vetting process for the proposed changes, we've had engaged and often passionate feedback from citizens and industry. Feedback that has helped us uncover both new courses of alignment with the MDP, as well as areas that require more clarity on the potential impacts. From the beginning, the question that we've been asking is, are there any unintended consequences that can be mitigated? And if so, what might be the best approach? As a direct result of the feedback we've received, we've made significant changes to the bylaw amendments. To ensure that we maintain that level of transparency and that we're able to sufficiently explore the impacts of these updated proposals, as an alternative, Council could defeat Bylaw 2017-29 and direct us to reintroduce these amended proposals as part of a new first reading, which would allow a new round of engagement, including a public hearing, through which we could solidify our understanding of the impacts of these amended proposals. That concludes the presentation. We're happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Prevost. And I just wanted to explore that last comment a little bit more. Stemming from discussions I've had over the last couple of weeks with admin around the sense that I have that this needs more work in the community before we move forward. So by defeating the bylaw, it stops this process in its tracks. And then if direction is received, then in the future, admin would be able to bring back for first reading a revised set of recommendations for changes to the land use bylaw. And if that were to occur, I would assume that all of the work that you've done to inform the proposed amendments this evening would perhaps create a start point for new discussions in the community.
We would agree. What we've done to date has so much input from the public that we have a great starting point to go back out and see how these could be made even better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to say, I think a number of the proposed amendments you've discussed are really responsive to what I've been hearing. But in regards to this question of defeating the bylaw and the effect, there had been suggestion of simply postponing the second reading until after the election, but then that would require essentially a new, another public hearing, because new councillors couldn't vote at second reading of a bylaw that they didn't attend the public hearing. So I suppose defeating the bylaw at this time and starting afresh with the new term would be preferable to just simply postponing a decision.
It also makes it clear to the public and industry what we're proposing to change, because we have had a few iterations through the public review process here.
Thank you. Mr. Park?
I was just going to elaborate on what Mr. Prevost was indicating, that if you postpone, then what comes back to council is the amended version at second reading, which tracking the amendments can be complex and confusing for the public. It's cleaner for the public's understanding if we bring forward a new version for first reading with the proposed amendments, and then they understand exactly what it is that is being proposed and where the starting point is.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Mr. Prevost, did you hear very much from the public about tiny homes and how they might fit into the modifications in this land use?
We heard of them informally, but not in specific respect to the proposals we're making here.
And the proposals you're making here, would they support that concept of tiny homes on those sorts of properties?
Yes, because you can essentially, a tiny home and the secondary suite, because of the sizes, could in very many cases be examples of either. Yes.
So these modifications and amendments you made would actually support the development of tiny homes in town?
Essentially, they support the development of any development that is smaller, 50 square meters or smaller. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from members of council? Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation. So if council is to defeat this bylaw, when would administration expect to bring this back after the election?
I'm going to defer to Mr. Fish on that one.
The short answer is as soon as possible. There's been a huge amount of work done here. And we have the, I think we have the framework to move forward reasonably quickly. That said, there has been some discussion about particularly 2 points that were intended, or 2 topics that were intended to be brought forward, both steep creek regulations and employee housing regulations, both of which we're waiting for more information rather than being included here. So if that information could be gained in a time of waiting an extra month, perhaps bringing it forward in December rather than in November, that might be something that we consider. Otherwise, all that to say, fairly soon, I would certainly hope before the end of 2017, at least to start the process.
Thank you.
Councillor Crowsert.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm getting a lot of questions about defeating it, so I'm thinking that there might be a motion being made, and so I'm wanting to understand, when it comes back, would it be possible for administration to also deal with, and I know it's not formally within the land use bylaw, but also deal with the enforcement concerns that were raised? I definitely picked that up through the public hearing, and I think it's a legitimate concern that if there's been an abuse of the current bylaws, and this could just exacerbate the problem. And so I think it would be really helpful to have that as part of the conversation as to what the town could do, or what it might look like in order to do that enforcement. Is that something that could be part of that conversation?
Certainly, and we can take direction from council to include that in new proposals that we bring forward at the next session. Yes. We agree that they could be helpful in mitigating some of the unintended consequences of what we're trying to achieve.
Right, and the concerns that were expressed, because I mean, it's quite, some people have had some terrible experiences, and when others hear that, they don't want to have that terrible experience. So how are we going to avoid that?
And we also hear, not related specifically to these changes, but that there are concerns with enforcement in other parts of development in Canmore, and we could look at all of that at the same time.
Thank you.
Further questions for Mr. Prevost? Seeing none, thanks very much for your report and all the work that you and your team have done to bring this matter to this point. I think the proposed amendments that you've provided are really responsive to a lot of what we've been hearing, certainly what I've been hearing. But with that, I will then move the council give second reading to bylaw number 2017-29, the land use bylaw update. But I will speak against the motion. I won't support this motion, recognizing that we have done a lot of work on this issue, on the many issues that are covered in this one bylaw. A lot of the intent is in response to conversations and community input over the years around, particularly around secondary suites, and how different legislation could encourage more affordable housing within established neighborhoods through an easier process for secondary suites. But I've been talking with a number of people in the community. I'm sure the rest of council has as well, and I sense that there hasn't really been adequate time since first reading to for all of us to discuss and understand the many amendments that are contained. So I would prefer that that we defer this decision, given there's an election and there'll be a new council. It is simpler to defeat, or it's more practical to defeat this bylaw and allow a new bylaw to come forward to a new council, and recognizing all the amount of work that has gone into getting to this point, and perhaps using that as the starting point, and to allow then for more fulsome discussions with the community, particularly in regards to the changes proposed around secondary suites. That's really where I've heard the most, not opposition, but uncertainty. People, I think, generally support the direction. They're just not too sure about how it'll play out, and I appreciate that concern. And we've only recently begun to, with intent, enforce the illegal use of secondary suites or units for short-term rentals, and I think that's something that really has to be addressed if we are going to be bringing in different regulations that will allow for more secondary suites. We want to make sure that those suites will be controlled and not simply put into the short-term rental market. If this motion is defeated by council tonight, that will allow, as I say, for a new process to begin, first reading of a revised bylaw to come forward, hopefully in the near future. We'll need to give new councillors an opportunity to get up to speed with some of this discussion. Some of it's very complex. And that would allow us adequate time for more public discussion and engagement. And it would require another public hearing to discuss whatever is suggested within the different bylaw. So for those reasons, I will vote against giving second reading bylaw 2017-29 this evening. Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I won't be able to support the motion either. We've had some really good public input and changes. Be nice to also include employee housing and Steep Creek items with something new coming forward.
Councillor Krauser to the motion.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, I also will not be supporting the motion. I think that what we heard through the public hearing was, I think, two major concerns that caught my attention were concerns around parking and concerns around enforcement of the use of these accessory dwellings. And so I think that that has to be part of this conversation going forward before we could have a second reading on it, and it will allow a fresh presentation of the changes that the administration would like to make based on what they've heard. I think that the conversation around enforcement should be what the town can and was able to do, and or what it would look like to increase enforcement, because I know there's costs associated with that. Around the parking issues, I know that there's a lot of neighborhoods that are already congested, and so I think that there needs to be a discussion around what other options are available to neighborhoods to deal with parking congestion, because we're certainly not the only community that's ever faced this. And so I think I've heard Mr. Prevost talk about some alternatives that he's knows about in other municipalities. And so I think that would be an excellent conversation to be having in conjunction with this coming back to alleviate those concerns expressed by residents.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. Well, first of all, I wanted to appreciate how much work has gone into this. I think you've done a really good job of incorporating ideas from the public hearings and from the many letters and concerns that were raised. So I wouldn't want to diminish that, because I think this is a really good start for the next phase. I won't support it at second reading, but I think it is important to consider that if it comes back, it has to go through another council anyway, so you might as well come back with the first reading. I think it would be a good opportunity to bring in some of those things that are currently missing, because I know you've highlighted that there's things that are not included, like the rezoning and the peaks of Grassy. And the other thing that might be considered is, you know, the distance from transit stops. So we might be able to refine some of those elements that are included. But I wanted to just say how much I appreciated the amount of work, and I found it very interesting to read, because I think it does address a lot of the issues that were raised. So thank you.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Well, this is going to kill me to say, but I'm going to vote against second reading. Accessory dwelling units have definitely been a priority in my mind, especially since we have received the paper that CCHC put together with regards to research across the province and the country with regards to accessory dwelling units and best and worst practices. I would agree with Councillor Sanford that there's been quite a lot of work that's been put into this, and there's been some really great feedback, which has brought us to this next point. I think that from a process perspective, it would be better to start it again at first reading. I would not want it to wait very long. I think that that the unintended consequence of waiting too long is going to be pricing people, in some cases seniors, out of their homes, because I've heard from a lot of late boomers and seniors that this was an opportunity for them to be able to stay on their property and keep their family nearby. And they're worried that that might not be the case should this process postpone much longer. That and other reasons in terms of housing locals and providing gentle density in our neighborhoods are all reasons why I do support secondary suites, but I support a better process and I prefer to defeat it at second reading and bring it back for first after the election. Thank you.
Councillor Comfort.
I also won't support the motion for all of the reasons that my colleagues have stated before. And further that what I heard from Mr. Prevost is the that bugbear of unintended consequences. It's like the monster in the closet, you know? And if we had more time to address to that we might find some more things that we could do to improve this bylaw. And the second thing is that with a new council, I think this is a perfect mechanism or vehicle to sharpen their teeth on and maybe bond with together, have a bonding experience as they go through this bylaw. So I also will not support the motion for those reasons.
Councillor Carter.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to add that, similar to Councillor McCallum's comments, I certainly wouldn't want to see this characterized as a vote against accessory suites, because we have that in our MDP, and we need to gain alignment with that. So I'm certainly in support of accessory suites and exploring ways that we can increase affordable housing, but we just need to include these other elements in the conversation. And so far, from what I've heard from my colleagues, is that nobody's really using that as a reason to defeat it either. So, great.
Thank you. Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Your Worship. Only want to add my thanks, Mr. Prevost and your team. Great work. Great work in a difficult place, and great recommendation.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. So on the motion to give second reading of bylaw 2017-29, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Those opposed? Motion's defeated unanimously. And I will then move that council give administration direction to return with a revised bylaw for first reading as soon as possible after the election. Is there discussion on that motion? Okay, or that motion is just as good. Thank you. Discussion on the motion? Councillor Cressert.
I'd like to propose an amendment. If you give me a moment, I could give it verbally. It's just a tack onto the end and include discussions with, and include discussions with respect to, well, thank you, parking solutions for neighborhoods and enforcement of land use bylaw.
You want to speak to that amendment?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that that's part of the conversation that's going forward. It may not find its way directly into the bylaw itself, because the bylaw sets out the rule, and then you have to talk about enforcement and what the plan is to enforce it. Also, with regards to parking, if there are going to be relaxations being brought forward, I think it's important for the community to understand what that impact could look like, and if there's some other solutions that, in conjunction with these changes, could be implemented in neighborhoods in order to alleviate parking and to ensure that residents have parking, and it's not a daily fight to try to see how close you can park to home.
Okay. I would be happy to accept that as a friendly amendment, but just given the nature of what we're discussing, I'll put that out for discussion. So, Councillor Palliser, it's amending motion. Is there discussion on that? Seeing none, I'll call the question on the amending motion. Those in favor? Opposed? So back to the main motion as amended. Move the council direct administration to bring back a revised land use bylaw update for first reading based on consultation carried out to date as soon as reasonably possible, and include discussion with respect to parking solutions for neighborhoods and enforcement of land use bylaw. Is there a discussion on that motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. I'll look to the acting CAO to see if there's...
Yes, there is. I apologize that it took me a while. So in the Economic Development Reserve for 2017, there's originally $320,000. There's been a draw of $120,000 so far, so $200,000 remaining. In 2018, there's the same amount, $320,000, but there is budgeted $50,000 for that, so there's $270,000 remaining in 2018.
Thank you. With that, I'll bring back the tabled motion. So the motion that was tabled is back on the table. Oh yes, it was the council provides support to the Bow Valley Chamber of Commerce's Innovate Canmore project as follows: in-kind access to SuperNet for the pilot program and $25,000 to fund an initial feasibility study focusing on municipal economic development diversification funded from the Economic Development Reserve. Is there discussion on that motion? Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I have no doubt that, that the Chamber of Commerce has the expertise to take on this kind of a project at all, but I would, understanding that we have done a few one-offs in the last year in absence of having an economic development plan or officer, but now that we know that we are looking at bringing one forward in 2018, I have real reservations in not putting out this kind of work to an RFP, and as a result, I will not be able to vote in favor of this. Again, I repeat, I think that the Chamber of Commerce would do a great job, and I believe that they would probably be shortlisted should an RFP go out, but at this point, I just see it as something that should go out to RFP, and I will not be able to support the motion as it is.
Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have to concur with Councillor McCallum. This is so, you know, it's probably a good thing, but if we're going out to do a feasibility study and then we've got our own department starting up potentially shortly after it, it's maybe just an accident, a bad timing, but it would be, I think it would be better spent going with the RFP or leave it till we get our own person involved.
Councillor Stanford.
Thank you, Worship. I know that we have the intent to hire a development officer in the town in 2018. I'm not sure that that person's going to start January 1st of 2018. I think this is going to be one of those situations where that person will be deferred or delayed, or it's going to take a while to start that. And I would support this just from the perspective that we're already 10 years behind on this sort of thing. So it's a very small amount of money. I think the people who are involved are knowledgeable, and I think they're connected to the community. I also think they have a good idea, and I know we've often talked about this type of economic diversification, and I think we've tried to get more and more opportunities for economic diversification, but we've often just deferred to the easy tourism solution. So I think intentionally to get this started for $25,000, I think this is a good idea. So I would support it.
Speaking to the motion, I will also support it very strongly. This sort of work has been envisioned and discussed in our community for more than 25 years. In fact, it responds directly to something that's in our 2010 Economic Development Plan, strategy plan, which the town is never actively engaged in, which is around doing this kind of work to build the knowledge-based sector. The Chamber, on its own, and working with members of the Chamber that are active in that knowledge-based sector and active with universities and connected to research done worldwide in Silicon Valley and Google DeepMind. Those are people that live here in Canmore, and now is the time is ripe for the town of Canmore to become active in building that sector. There's a lot of interest, particularly from the United States, in those research industries to look north of the border, given what's happening down there. Alberta has been identified as a key location to grow this industry. Google DeepMind recently opened a research laboratory in Edmonton, and if the town of Canmore doesn't take the lead on these initiatives in small town Alberta, we're going to lose out that opportunity. Cochrane is all over the same hope. Okotoks, Airdrie, they'll all be trying to build that sector within their own communities. I will support this motion. I think it's a very small amount of money to come out of the Economic Development Reserve, which we collect specifically for these purposes. So I will support the motion. Councillor Seeley.
I'll also support the motion. I've got a lot of confidence in our new chamber. I've been to several conversation cafes, and I'm happy with the chamber and the talents around the table. I think this could also inform hiring an economic development officer in 2018, and is important information for council to have, so I will be supporting it.
Councillor Comfort.
I also will support it. At first I was not so much in support because, again, as Councillor McCallum mentioned, the one-off projects and the intention to bring this kind of work in-house to some degree. I think that it dovetails or will dovetail with the broadband investigation that we're doing, and I think that's a good thing. I think that for the part two, if the chamber were to come forward after the feasibility study to say, okay, here's the results and this is how we want to move forward, and we want, I don't know, pick a number, 100K to continue or 200K, that's the point at which I would want to see management from in-house. So I would like to support this in order to have it move forward, because we can't kind of sit here spinning our wheels and not having any kind of action on this front. But coming down the road, I definitely would want to see this be handled by the town.
Councillor Krauswijk.
Thank you, Your Worship. Prior to the motion being tabled, I spoke in support, so I won't repeat myself, but I would like to point out there's been a couple of mentions of a economic development officer for the town. Of course, we don't know if we will have an economic development officer for the town in-house. What's coming back this fall is a report on that for council to consider and decide whether they would like to do that or not for 2018. And I think it's an excellent point that this is information that can help feed that discussion, as well as going in parallel rather than waiting. So,
further discussion on the motion, Councillor McCallum.
And I would just like to tell you all that I think that all your points are right. It's time to get a diversification and everything else. The only point I want to make is that I'd like to see it to RFP. So I support you, but I don't.
Councillor Russell.
I'm not sure quite what to say after that one. That's there really isn't a lot to add to it. I guess my only thought, with all the caliber of the conversation that's come up around the table, this would have really benefited from a bit of a report again.
If there's no further discussion on the motion that's shown on the overhead, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried with Councillor Russell and McCallum in opposition. We'll move on now to item G1, the proposed new off-leash dog parks. Ms. Ling-Win.
Good evening, Mayor Borman and members of council. Myself and Ms. Lisa Guest will be co-presenting this request for decision for the proposed new dog parks. For the public in the gallery who haven't met me, my name is Lori Risling-Wynn. I am the Sustainability Coordinator for the Town of Canmore, and I'm also a Development Planner. So we wanted to start by providing an overview of the presentation, which closely follows the staff report that Council received. We'll begin by discussing the background relevant to the project and how we ended up here today, the site selection process, an overview of the 3 proposed sites, public consultation process, and a summary of what we heard, highlight some concerns identified and considerations to address these, and then finish up with conclusions and recommendations. I'd like to begin by providing a bit of background on events and previous discussions which led up to today's request for decision. In 2016, a capital project was approved to consider up to 3 new off-leash dog parks in existing residential neighborhoods and engage the public on the options and report back to council. The 2014 Human Use Management Review, which began at that time and carried on for 2 years after that date, identified the need to consider additional dog parks throughout the community. Similarly, the Open Space and Trails Plan, which Council accepted for planning purposes in 2015, identified the need to consider additional dog parks as well. There are currently areas of town not serviced by a dog park. We have 3 existing dog parks, but they are at disparate locations throughout the community, and they're definitely neighborhoods that don't have access to a dog park without driving. And our 2016 census numbers informed us that we have 1,480 dogs licensed in the community. This does not include dogs licensed in other communities owned by semi-permanent residents or dogs brought by tourists. And we also know that there are also unlicensed dogs within the community as well. So it's likely that this value is underrepresented. So the monitoring that was undertaken in partnership with Alberta Environment and Parks as part of the Human Use Management Review does provide some understanding of the off-leash dog issue within the valley. Council has seen a presentation from Ms. Melanie Percy earlier in the year, which went into quite a bit more detail with respect to this, the study and the information that's been collected to date. I'm only going to touch on the information related to off-leash dogs. So if you recall, 77 cameras were deployed across the community and the valley. Over 2 million images have been collected over 24 months, and this was preliminary data that was presented. So within the camera data, 356,591 individuals were identified. Along with those individuals were 50,000 dogs. Approximately 58% of those dogs were off-leash. So from this, we know that people want this opportunity in the community, and in the absence of a place to do it, such as an off-leash dog park, people will and are doing it elsewhere. In order to successfully change behavior, there also needs to be alternative locations available for that behavior. Also, as part of the Three Sisters Mountain Village Area Structure Plan EIS, we also collected, or Golder, on behalf of TSMV, collected data also on off-leash dogs in areas adjacent to the proposed development areas, also done through remote cameras. This information was made public through the EIS that Golder provided to Council as part of the ASP amendment package. So Council's seen this information previously as well. It does identify off-leash dog use by remote camera. The orange star is the location of the proposed site at Hubman. The green highlighted area is the wildlife corridor. The yellow are unofficial trails. The green are official trails. The yellow hatched is the proposed ASP amendment area, but it's also the undeveloped golf course. And you can see that there were dogs reported off leash by remote camera throughout that entire area. So just to summarize, the intent is to curb off-leash activity in areas where it is not desired. One of the things we can do within the toolbox of managing human use is to provide additional dog parks throughout the community. There's a demonstrated need for this type of amenity. And the town of Canmore and its residents have expressed a desire to be a leader in environmental stewardship, and we believe this should include our efforts to live successfully with wildlife. So regarding the site selection process, initially 16 sites were identified. These were shortlisted to 10, and then a final 3 proposed sites were selected from that 10. The 10 criteria that we use to evaluate the sites are demonstrated in the table. The first being ownership. So is the land owned by the town of Canmore, or could leasing be arranged? Compliance with the land use district. So are parks either a permitted or a discretionary use? The number of dogs in the area, the potential to address off-leash activity in nearby wildlife corridor habitat patch, walkability, so is there the ability for people to walk on municipal pathways, the number and location of adjacent homes, the extent of hazard tree removal or scrubbing, and then the final 3 criteria, because they were residential parks, were considered, but were not considered essential. This is also consistent with the approach other communities have taken with respect to these last 3 criteria. So I'd like to speak for a moment to the Open Space and Trails Plan, which recommended adopting off-leash dog park guidelines, including a minimum size and distance from residential or commercial properties. These criteria were included under the Open Space for the Future section of the OSTP, and while not explicitly stated within the document, the intent of those guidelines were meant to inform new and future development. An effort was made to look for Canmore-owned properties which met these criteria in existing neighborhoods. However, the reality is that of the 10 sites, only 3 met the size threshold and none met the proposed distance threshold. The town of Canmore has no large parcels of land to put residential dog parks in existing neighborhoods. And the OSTP also indicated that micro dog parks in existing neighborhoods could be considered. These residential parks can be smaller, are intended to be walked to, and may be located in proximity to existing homes. The City of Calgary has several good examples of residential dog parks in existing neighborhoods that have been done well, where their guidelines have also been relaxed. So I'd like to share this example of Roxborough Park in Calgary with you. And if you just bear with me for a moment, I'm just gonna pull it up on Google Maps. So this is the Roxborough neighborhood of Calgary. You'll see that it's downtown, it's proximal to downtown. The Sky Dome, the Saddle Dome is up here. So this park services a large area of downtown Calgary. It includes single-family homes, multifamily residential, as well as high-rise condos. So this dog park is not fenced. There's no parking provided aside from on-street parking, and it is across the street from existing homes. So these homes were built in the 1940s. They're expensive real estate within the city of Calgary, and the dog park went in after the homes were built. This park is well used and well loved.
Mayor and Council. For those that don't know me, I'm Lisa Guest, Supervisor of Parks. Today I'd like to share with you information about each site. This is the Hubman site in the picture you're looking at. The yellow spot in the center is the Hubman proposed dog park site. The corridor, the wildlife corridor in green, is within 500 meters of this site. Within this orange circle that you can see, the inner circle, there is 79 registered dogs. Between the Crossbow area development down here and the new start of the Three Sisters Mountain Village development, there's 138 registered dogs that we know of. The red lines on this map show the trail system which make this site easily accessible to everybody in this neighbourhood walking. The area of this park is 1.6 acres. Here's a close-up of this site. On-site public consultation was performed. We walked through the site with the intent of mitigating concerns via site design. The entire yellow area you see is the actual site. The red trail system, you can see the orange lines indicating distances to adjacent homes. The blue circles you can see are gates where residents and participants decided these were the best spots for those. The green stars you can see are trees to buffer noise and increase privacy. The large cutback you can see here was a site design to create a buffer to the residential homes there at Hubman 2. The blue line on the right-hand side you can see could be a potential barrier put on the fence called a frustration barrier, which I'll show you next, which could lead to helping decrease any noise from potential barking dogs. Each site gate entrance would have a sign, Each site would have a sign that would encourage residents to do the right thing with their pets and have etiquette, hours of use, and so forth. This is the frustration barrier that I just spoke about. It's some shielding that can be put onto a fence. It can be any color, and that is something that can be considered at this site. I'd like to walk you through the site as we did with residents. This is looking from the lower right corner of the site by Cafero Court. This is looking west into the park. The red lines I've drawn on here, sorry, my drawing's not so great, is the potential fence line. They're not perfect, but they're in the area where they would be. This is from that same location, looking down into the homes at Cafero. This is at the far west end of the park. This is looking at a home on Miscow Close. This is looking from the far end of the west end of the course, or the park, looking west. It's looking east, sorry. Looking east. The red line here is the proposed fence location. The park would be on the left side of this line. The orange line you can see would be the continuation of our fence line had we not put the buffer to the home at Hubman 2. The entire right side of this line is condominium property. This is looking from that proposed buffer back up into that Hubman 2 home. This is from the far east end of the course, looking west. This is from the east end of the course, looking towards the Cafero Court homes, the first slide that I showed you. The red line is the proposed fence location. This is the far east end of the park. As you can see, there is a buffer to the disc golf course tee on the right-hand side. Next to the Palliser site. The Palliser site, as you can see in the middle again, with its 500-metre buffer, has 43 licensed dogs within 500 metres of the site. There's also an expected, well, we know, 143 units being developed within 320 metres of this site. So we're anticipating additional dogs. The site lies within 120 metres of a wildlife corridor. The site is 1.1 acres. During on-site public consultation, I will add that this site is owned by CCHC, and for the town to use this site, we would enter into an MOU with them, and we have permission from them to do that. Okay, so you can see the closest residence at this site is 20 metres. Through consultation on site, we had originally spoke with residents, lost my mouse, there. We had originally spoke with residents about having this site on the far west end, so it would encompass this small area where the mouse is right now. Unfortunately, this cannot take place right there because there's a large drainage swale at this end of the site. We've had to move it further into the centre of the park. The blue spot is the gate. Other considerations brought up at this site was the removal of burr plants so they don't get stuck to dogs, that only having one gate at that end to minimise noise, and a buffer between the playground and the dog park to mitigate barking dogs and for the safety of children. I'll walk you through the site briefly. This is looking east into the current site. This would be where the proposed new gate location is, looking east. This is looking from the far end, the east end of the park, towards the Hector building. This is from the east end of the park, looking to the Blackstone building. From the far east end of the park, looking west. Now to the Spring Creek site. Again, the Spring Creek site is centred in the middle in the yellow dot. Oh, I'm missing a page. We have 80 registered or licensed dogs within 500 metres at this site, with the potential for the possible, we know, happening Spring Creek development expansion. This site would require some hazard tree removal and some ground brush removal, somewhat similar to what we would do with fire smarting at this site. The site is 1.59 acres. On-site public consultation, it was thought it best that we only have one gate at this site. We now know there may be the potential for 2. Housing is 40 metres at its closest to this site, with this area here being including a 10-metre buffer of ER that would not be disturbed. Only hazard trees would be removed. There wouldn't be any limbing or scrubbing in this area. Dogs at this site would not have access to water. This was a concern for some residents. The only way the dogs are going to have access to water is if they're on leash and they're outside the park. Okay, so they wouldn't be disturbing the ER and the bank front, and they wouldn't be able to get closer to those homes. Other considerations at this site, you may have heard there is an owl did rest at that nest in this site for the past winter. Although on consultation with a Calgary expert, there is a chance, or not either way, 50% that owl may return. He may return if the park went in, and he may return if it didn't go in. It could go either way. If we were to put in our park, there's a chance he could move out of the area. He would move within, or he would move likely within 1 to 2 kilometres of the site. And from a local child expert, we understand that this owl is possibly the owl that used to reside in Centennial Park. Okay. Earlier we had a question about a trail at this site. This is true. A trail has been pushed through this site. And I could probably have Albert speak to this one.
Sure. A trail basically connecting the pedestrian bridge at this site is part of the conceptual plan, as approved in the area redevelopment plan for Spring Creek. So the intent is that a trail be built there at some point. I'm not sure exactly the motivation, but they suddenly went ahead and started constructing that. As soon as the town became aware of that, we stopped because we hadn't gone through the formal approval process regarding the details of that trail. As part of further discussions, we feel confident that it is possible to put the trail in association with the dog park as proposed. But those details will be finalized with the developer. Right now, the town owns the land as it is municipal reserve, but they are responsible for doing the trail improvement at some point.
So just to understand that Spring Creek started building a trail without proper approval in place?
That's correct. I mean, the approval is conceptually there through the area redevelopment plan, but normally we would look for the details, exactly how wide the material base. They are familiar with those, but we want to have that discussion in advance of normally in advance of the construction.
Okay, and so that project's been stopped by the town?
That's correct. That trail aspect has, yes.
Okay. Oh, I'll quickly walk you through this site. For those who haven't been to the Spring Creek site, this is looking east along the CP tracks. This is from the middle of the park, and you can see the vegetation here. Those trees would be limbed up to around 8 feet, and some of the low vegetation would be removed, so that would allow dog owners to pick up any feces that was left behind from their dog and allow them to safely walk through this site, just like any other park. This is looking to Spring Creek Mountain Village from the east end of the park, and this is the 10-metre buffer that would go undisturbed. This is looking from the mid section of the dog park across to the mid-centre housing at Spring Creek, and the same, this would not be disturbed. And this is looking at the west end of the building. You can see the Opera House here on the right, and this is to the large east building. This is from the meadow right opposite the Opera House. So this would be the furthest east extent of the park. As part of this, we thought it was important that everybody know we already have a residential dog park. It's on leased land. There's 147 registered dogs within 500 metres of this site. It's easily accessible and walkable. And how this park went in. The park went in 2009. The public consultation process included residents being advised that a dog park was going in, and where consultation involved residents having input on design only. Resident complaints were no different than any other at this site. Smell, noise, poo, privacy, unsightly, trespassing, house values. As part of the site design, residents requested that trees go in on the left side of this site and that there be a single gate on the right side of this site to decrease the amount of traffic behind the condominiums. This is the park just last week. This is looking from the from the Bowl Diamond. Oh, I'll go back one. This site also shares a common fence with another user group, which is the Bowl Association. There's also a sidewalk along the road, which also shares a common fence at this site. This is looking east from the top corner, where the Bowl Diamond meets the dog park. This is the far east fence line, adjacent to the condominium. This is looking directly at those condos. This is from those condos into the dog park itself. It should be noted that dog parks like this provide obviously a space for people to run their dogs off leash. People groom their dogs in this dog park, and they also train them good skills and habits. They're a great gathering place for all ages of the community.
Could you remind me what year we approved that park?
2009.
2009.
So if you recall, part of Council's direction during the budget process was that administration engage the public about the potential sites and report back to Council with the results. And to this end, public consultation was undertaken. An online survey was open from the beginning of July until the beginning of August. On-site consultations were done during the month of August. A direct mail-out was sent to adjacent residents in the broader community. Also within those neighborhoods were informed by a social media campaign, print media, the Town of Canmore website, and a number of radio interviews that were done throughout the summer. So as Council is well aware, all three sites received varying degrees of opposition and support. 414 people responded to the survey. These survey responses are actual responses. They aren't a percentage, so just bear that in mind. The charts summarize the responses to the online survey. The survey did not explicitly ask, do you support this proposed location, yes or no? However, an effort was made to generally understand levels of support, opposition, or a neutral opinion based on the responses provided. The survey responses provided general feedback and were open to all residents. So based on the survey responses, the letters and emails received, a number of concerns were identified. Residents were concerned about the smell of the dog park, and as with all of our existing dog parks, dog poo will be collected by responsible dog owners. This will be encouraged via signage, bags, and bins at the site. And we found that responsible owners also take pride and ownership in their local park and will ask others to pick up after their dogs if they do not. We heard concerns about wildlife being displaced from the 3 proposed sites. And to be perfectly frank, large ungulates within the urban space of the community do pose public safety risks. And ideally, ungulates would move to more suitable preferred locations within the corridors and patches. They also bring in carnivores, which can add additional public risk to the community. We heard concerns about proximity. These are residential dog parks, as I've previously noted, and are meant to be walked to and proximal to the residents that they serve. We've given a good example of how these types of dog parks can be done well, and we believe that there's the opportunity to have that exist within Canmore as well. Noise and barking were identified. Some considerations to address these include the gates that Ms. Guest has already spoken about, the planting of trees, the screening along the fence, and signage. Parking was identified as an issue. Parking is available at both the Hubman and Spring Creek sites, and street parking is available at each site as well. And again, the intent is for users to walk to these parks. These are not meant to be destination dog parks. They're meant to be neighborhood dog parks for the adjacent residents. We've heard concerns that property values will be decreased as a result of locating these parks in these neighborhoods. There's no evidence to validate that this has or will occur in relation to the siting of a dog park. Generally, property values increase when amenities are located nearby. And finally, access and trespass was an issue that was identified, and each site is accessible by a municipal path. We wanted to give you a sense of some of the comments that were provided in response to the survey. So comments in opposition, and we've just given a couple examples of each. It's too small, would ruin the pathways, definitely not. I'm very opposed to this site. There's no parking, so people will park in the neighborhood. It will be messy. Most dog owners do not pick up after their dogs. It will be loud. Comments in support, again, from the survey. So close for me. If it doesn't happen, I will be very disappointed. Adding off-leash parks will hopefully give people a great option, and they'll stop walking their dogs off-leash in the wildlife corridors. I think it would be terrific to have an off-leash park in the neighborhood. People get to meet their neighbors.
I just wanted to run through, for those who haven't been to the sites, and explain to you what these sites may look like. The current Elk Run site has double closing gates. This is to calm dogs down as they enter and exit the site and allow the owners to have full control of their pet. This is also a safety mechanism for them. All gates are self-closing. The large spring you can see here, and they have soft closing here. So regardless, if somebody accidentally leaves something open, it is going to close. All fences would be 5-foot chain link for safety of both wildlife and pets. Each site will be outfitted with mutt meat bag dispensers at each gate. signs. This is a current sign, and we're happy to work with those communities, and we have got feedback on what those signs should look like and what they should say. Some things brought forward as part of mitigations were hours of operation, as this one already does have, and more information about picking up after your pet and responsible dog ownership. Signs to discourage trespassing include directional signage to how to get to each site. And then we're back to the frustration barrier for those who wanted to see it.
So I'll just finish up with our conclusions and recommendations. So all 3 sites could accommodate dog parks to meet the needs of the community. There are no alternative sites that are feasible to locate dog parks within existing neighborhoods within the town. Council could direct administration not to pursue additional off-leash dog parks at this time, and rather aim to include this type of amenity in new greenfield development as it occurs. However, administration does not recommend this approach, as it could be many years before new development may take place, and with the associated locating of new dog parks. This is a pressing need now to address, and existing areas of town will still be unserved. Administration sincerely acknowledges there is both opposition and support for these sites, and that this is a difficult decision. Some may say an imperfect solution to a complex problem. However, the community has also expressed a desire to protect and live successfully with wildlife and a willingness to take actions to do so. Additional dog parks throughout the community are one of the initiatives we believe will help move the community towards this. And for these reasons, we put forward this recommendation. That council approve the installation of the off-leash dog park at Hubman. That council approve the installation of the off-leash dog park at Palliser. At this point in time, and due to the amount of budget that was available for the project, we're prioritizing these 2 sites and recommending that they be approved because of the prevalence of off-leash dog use in the adjacent wildlife corridors and on the unfinished golf course, and because these areas are also further away from existing dog parks. If council chooses not to approve either the first or second option, we would further recommend that council approve the installation of the off-leash dog park at Spring Creek. This concludes our presentation, and we are happy to answer any additional questions you may have.
Thank you very much. That was a really complete presentation on a complicated matter, which on the face of it you wouldn't think would be that complicated, but it is. I'm curious about, or just want to speak a little bit about the self-imposed constraints that the town put on, staff put on themselves around establishing the locations, the constraint of it having to be on town-owned land or land that town had easy access to. It would seem to me that we could have expanded that the potential sites if we were able to talk with the province or private landowners about possible sites that are equally accessible to these neighborhoods, at least a couple of the neighborhoods. Was there any discussion at all with the province or the private landowners about identifying possible sites?
There was. At least 2 of the 16 sites that were in the initial list were Alberta Transportation land. So it is possible to speak with Alberta Transportation. We have done that with the 1A dog park. So it potentially could be an option. Looking at Town of Canmore property was the most efficient way to move forward, so we identified those sites as priorities. We also did speak with TSMV about a number of parcels that potentially could have been dog parks that Three Sisters Mountain Village owns. At that time, they were not interested in having those discussions with us.
At what time was that?
Right around the ASP first reading amendment, yeah.
That's correct. I'll just jump in here a little bit. I was part of those discussions with Three Sisters. They certainly expressed a willingness and understand the need for these, as you can see in what was proposed. The need to incorporate off-leash dog parks has been considered. There was a combination of issues that came together at that time, that there were a number of other unresolved issues, and it wasn't an ideal time to pursue those discussions further, shall we say. I think there's the possibility to do that, but one of the other sites that was looked at is somewhat similar, although it's not town of Canmore land. It's adjacent to different residential properties, and that site was brought forward in 2012 as part of the area structure plan that came to council for first reading consideration at that point, and there was a lot of discussion about the off-leash dog part. So I'm speaking specifically between Casal and Miscow in that area there. So I feel we looked comprehensively, and there were no easy other sites.
In looking at the maps, it appears to me that there's some potential sites close to the Three Sisters neighborhoods that we're talking about that are Three Sisters lands, and if these motions aren't approved, if we're not able to move forward with these proposed parks, I think there might well be a positive discussion with Three Sisters, particularly their discussions are going, there's positive discussions between town and Three Sisters these days, so it might be something for future consideration. Of the three sites that you've proposed, I have to be honest and say that the site that I have the only real concern about is the Palliser. It is, I mean, it's right in your face if you live in that building, and I'm certain that wasn't your preference. What other opportunities presented themselves in your study in the Palliser region?
So the town does have a piece of MR behind the Blackiston building. However, it is directly adjacent to the wildlife corridor. So that, for obvious reasons, didn't seem like the best choice either.
Okay, and the westernmost piece of Mustache Lands, which is provincial land, would that lend itself in any way to this use, do you think? It's very similar in nature.
Yeah.
So it's the other half of the Mustache, as it were. So that is, yes, correctly owned by Alberta Social Housing Corporation. So we haven't initiated discussions with them on the possibility of that, but that's something that could be considered.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Krausert.
Thank you, Your Worship. And first of all, thank you, Ms. Risling-Wynn and Ms. Guest, for your very thorough and really good presentation. I do have some questions, though. We currently have dog parks, and we currently have a problem with people with dogs in the wildlife corridors. So do we have any data that would support the suggestion that more dog parks will take people out of the wildlife corridors?
So we do have some enforcement statistics that demonstrate again the number of off-leash dogs in these areas. The social science suggests that if we don't provide an alternative location while we're doing enforcement, is that the behavior will not change. We don't have any concrete data at this point in time because we haven't put these dog parks in yet, so we don't have we do fortunately have a very good baseline now with respect to off-leash activity as a result of the monitoring that was done with Alberta Environment Parks with the Human Use Management Review. So that data could be accessed to ask and answer that question in the future. But what we do know is that enforcement lacks the ability to change behavior unless those people are given an opportunity to do that behavior elsewhere.
Or perhaps the enforcement, the penalty changes? Something has to change.
Consider, yeah.
Right. So I've used all of the current off-leash dog areas with my dog, and my experience is usually when I'm there, there's some other people there, but it's not overly crowded. Are our current dog parks being overused? Like, do we have demand that is not being satisfied?
No, and I wouldn't say that was one of the symptoms that we were trying to address. Like, we haven't received complaints that the existing dog parks are overcrowded. This was an attempt to address this issue of off-leash dog parks, address the issue of walkability and proximity to existing residential neighborhoods, and in fact it was council's direction that we do that. So it supports livable Canmore and increasing the walkability of the community. So it wasn't so much to address a concern that our existing off-leash dog parks are overcrowded.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Your Worship. Can I go back to the enforcement stats with you, please? I appreciate the social science model that says, build it, we'll get them out of here. But you said 58% of the dogs that were encountered on the cameras were off leash. I think, do you not think that's a bigger problem that perhaps, you got to put the hammer down somewhere? And the follow up to that one, the question I guess is, how many tickets have we written? Because maybe this is the point, like 58%, it seems to me that number of dogs was in the multi-thousands. That's an epidemic. Like, we should be pounding the daylights out of those guys because it's the biggest disrespect. I don't know if there's anybody that needs much more education. Most people living here know that your dog chasing around an elk or chasing something around is bad news. And with that level of disrespect, I'm wondering that instead of providing more facilities that are impeding on the public and meeting with opposition, whether it's valid opposition or not, doesn't matter. We should be out, to me, with some statistics and some backup. Let's send our bylaw folks out, give them a change of duty and go out and straighten some of this out. They know what to do.
Yeah, I believe Michael Orr is here.
The tall kid.
He did offer to answer any questions related to enforcement specifically, so I would defer to him if that's all right. Mr. Orr?
Good evening, Mayor Borman and members of council. I'd just like to clarify, the question is how many tickets and warnings we've issued in
I'd like to see tickets, but I'm more interested in tickets relating to the corridor activity.
Well, as it stands in the past year, we've had 78. This was between September 12th, 2016 and September 12th, 2017. That being said, the corridors themselves are provincially regulated areas that the conservation officers must patrol, and we don't typically go deep into the wildlife corridors because that is their area of jurisdiction, so we can't provide any hard statistics for those areas.
Okay, but we're building a facility to mitigate that problem. Oh, thank you, you've answered the question.
Councillor Seeley.
Ms. Risling-Wynn, thanks for the presentation. It's really good information, and I think time to take a look at these corridor issues and everything else. And you're right, with enforcement, it's only one part of the problem. If people don't have a place to go that's reasonable to run their dogs off leash, there's conflict. When you talked about the open space and trails plan, there's a setback requirement, and none of the sites you looked at qualify for that. So I guess a couple of questions. Where did that setback come from? And it seems a little unreasonable if we can't meet that in the sites that you looked at.
So through the development of the open space and trails plan, and I apologize, I wasn't part of that project. I wasn't the lead planner, but I believe discussions were had with the participants who were consulted, and an evaluation of best practices from other communities. As I mentioned in my presentation, that piece of the open space and trails plan is in a section which is titled Open Spaces for the Future. And so while not explicit, the intent was that we would be looking at new dog parks in new development specific to those particular setback and size guidelines.
And just help me understand, you said it's comparable to other communities. We have a pretty limited land base. So what community, and I guess we don't need to get into it, but I would suspect that other communities have more land, and so that's where the distance maybe came from? Potentially.
We looked at municipalities across Alberta, for example, so it is possible that they have more accessible land available to them, and they're developing at a different rate per se than Town of Canmore is. But the fact of the matter is, when we looked at those criteria for those locations that were identified, we realized that none of them met them.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions at this time for Ms. Risling-Wynn or Ms. Guest? Councillor McCallum.
Thank you for your very thorough presentation. I was wondering if you could speak to me a little bit more about the MOU with CCHC and whether the proposed dog park on that property would be an interim use, as I understand that is zoned for residential at some point.
Yes, so we have...
At some point, it is zoned for residential,
yes,
period.
Yes, yeah, and so there is an acknowledgement that that site would be a temporary site. We have discussed it with CCHC. They have agreed to enter into a memorandum of understanding with us for the temporary use of that site for the purpose of a dog park. They suggested that we have it as an annual term, renewable annually, with a 90-day termination clause suitable to both parties.
Thank you.
Is there further discussion or questions with administration? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Risling-Wynn. In conjunction with that question about CCHC, is that land developable prior to flood mitigation?
No, it's right on the edge of the area impacted more directly by the Steep Creek hazard. So it is somewhat waiting for more information on the mitigation plans.
So the temporary nature of it will also be determined by the flood mitigation that's provided to develop it, right?
By the long term, yes,
right.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions at this time? Seeing none, thank you all for your presentation and answers. And I'll put a series of motions on the table for discussion and vote. The first being that Council approve the installation of the off-leash dog park at Hubman. I'll speak to this motion in opposition, regretfully in opposition, because I fully support our vision. We have to develop neighborhood dog parks in residential neighborhoods. We have to do everything we can to set up other locations for the public to run their dogs in so they don't go into the corridors. The point that Councillor Russell was speaking to, that's what's driving this need to create neighborhood off-leash dog parks. So I'm very supportive of moving forward in that fashion and approving over time a number of parks in neighborhoods, existing neighborhoods. However, the concern I have that's preventing me from supporting this motion and would inform my decision on subsequent motions as well is around the direction that we approved 2 years ago in the open space and trails plan. And while I recognize that that plan's not a binding piece of legislation. It is, to me, very clear that council 2 years ago had established a minimum distance from residential or commercial property of 120 meters and the minimum of half a hectare in area. In hindsight, I think we should have not been that specific, recognizing the real problem in our community of then finding any locations for this purpose. So depending on where the first few motions go, I may, at the end of this discussion, propose that we bring the open space trails plan back for further review. But my vote is informed purely on a process question, which is around approving high-level plans for planning purpose and then abiding by what we've put into the plan. So I won't be able to support the motion. I do want to note once again that this decision is not being made as a result of the thinly veiled threats that were raised in this council chamber not too long ago. We were clearly being told that if we approved this off-leash dog park in the Hubman area, we would end up in court. And yet, a number of residents who support that location and have written council to say that didn't feel the need to bring lawyers into this room and turn our council chambers into a courtroom. So while I'm offended by that approach, I will vote against the location at Hubman. Councillor Crowsert.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think it's clear from the survey results, and as well as the comments that we've received for and against, that the only thing that's certain about the decisions we're about to make is that regardless of the decision made, there's going to be a considerable number of people disappointed. I would like to preface my comment about this particular location with my own experience with dog parks is that the town has done a very good job of operating them. They're kept in good shape. They're not particularly noisy, although there is the occasional dog barking, but usually they're playing and running around. And they're not particularly smelly because actually, unlike a lot of what you see along trails within the dog parks, the owners actually do a pretty good job of cleaning up after each other and policing each other. I actually find more of the feces on the trails as opposed to in dog parks. But turning to this particular initiative, it seems to me that the motivation behind more dog parks comes from a suggestion in the Human Use and Management Review, and not out of a sense of our current dog parks being overused. It's about trying to get people with their dogs out of the dog park or out of the wildlife corridor. But I think that there's a fundamental flaw in that rationale. In order to, I agree that, ideally, to provide the social incentive to get people out of a place where you're penalizing them, you should provide an alternative. But I don't think the dog park represents that alternative. People who are in the wildlife corridors with their dogs are there exercising themselves. They're walking, they're running, they're biking. Their dogs are with them. I know that when I want to exercise, I walk my dog. When I don't want to exercise, I go to the dog park. That's when he can run around and chase the ball, and I just have to stand there, and as long as I have a treat, he keeps coming back. So I think there's a fundamental flaw. If we want to provide an alternative, we have to provide an alternative outside of the corridors where people can run and walk and bike with their dogs. And hopefully do it in a way that is not interfering with other people who also want to use facility. So I think that there's this fundamental flaw in that correlation. I do not think approval of more dog parks, especially of small ones, will get people out of the corridor. So if that was the opposite of that, I would think that there is a best interest of the community being served in having more parks, getting out of the dog parks, and it may cause some discomfort to local neighborhoods. But without that best interest, we have to follow the guidelines that we followed. And the open space and trails sets out 120 meters. I'm not certain that I would be in favor of changing that without a really good reason why, because I don't think that we need more dog parks just for the sake of more dog parks. And I'm a dog owner, and there's lots of places to walk your dog. If you want to do it off-leash, there are a few options, but once again, it's just because you're wanting the dog to run. It's not for your own purposes. With regards to this particular site, I have a lot of problems with it. I was one of the councillors who raised concerns with it being used as a disc golf course. And the reasons that I had concerns about it is to have sort of regulated human activity at all times of the day in very close proximity to residences, and sometimes there was misbehavior of the people, such as urinating right outside somebody's window. I'm not certain why I would want to approve having more unregulated use right outside people's residences and have them be able to watch a bunch of dogs urinating. So I will be voting in opposition to this motion.
Councillor Comfort?
Well, that was interesting, Councillor Krauser, to hear your point of view. First, I'd like to commend admin on the job that they did. I went on a tour on my own to walk through and get an impression. And then I went on a tour with Ms. Guest and Ms. Riesling-Wynn and with Mr. Orr, and was able to see Mr. Orr catch somebody with their dog off leash, and that was interesting. So I'm of two minds because the number of people that said that this neighborhood dog park would work for them, and because of the kind of amenity that I know neighborhood dog parks to be. I've been to quite a few: Toronto, Ottawa, London, Ontario, BC, in Victoria and in Vancouver, and my experience is the same as Councillor Krauser's, that they're not places of violence and stink, which is sort of the level of emails that we got. That being said, there's clear, vehement opposition from the people who surround this dog park. So the people that are opposed to it are violently opposed to it. And that's a shame, because neighborhood dog parks generally are an amenity and generally actually increase property values. And they're a place where neighbors meet each other in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. And it makes a neighborhood and speaks to the kind of character that I'd like to see Canmore retain, and the kind of things that happen. Not so much here, not so much as they used to. So, that being said, I'll do my devil's advocate thing here. The OSTP, this issue reminds me of the flow trail. So, I don't know if you all remember that issue, which we didn't approve because we felt that administration had made a misstep in bringing it forward before the zoning was changed, so that use was actually going to work for that whole area. So, and that may one day come back for the new council. So I think that we have to go back and amend the OSCP, and because we don't actually have in existing neighborhoods a piece of land that meets the strictures of those of that document. So I'd like to see that change before this could be approved, and I know there'll be a lot of very disappointed people. We have to fix that first, and then we can come back. And again, I will really commend Ms. Guest and Ms. Rissling-Wynn for the work that they have done on this. It was exceptional. Thank you very much.
Councillor Stanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentations again. I'm really wondering upon what basis we would go back and amend the OSTP, because it was a document that was thoroughly vetted, and I mean, the input to that document was a standardized type of information. It wasn't just, well, this is what we feel. So to go back and amend it, I just don't know what the mechanism would be to amend it. Can anybody speak to that?
Yeah, it's a plan of councils, and in fact, I didn't say amend, I said bring it back for review. Is it a possibility? Any of council's plans can come back to council at any time we want for a review. It doesn't infer anything other than that.
So I'm just thinking that we would reconsider the parts of the OSTP based on our particular needs. Is that what you're saying?
I'm thinking that in general terms, high-level planning documents like that are approved for planning purposes tend to be not quite as specific as this is in this clause. So when we were looking at that, I think if at the time, if the planners had thought through and thought about the impact of that specific clause, it may have been worded a little differently.
Well, I guess it's one of those conversations about unintended consequences. So yeah. If the planning document's too restrictive, then something that we believe we should do, which actually we directed administration to go and do this research and to consider the options, and they've come back with information that suggests that none of the options could possibly match what's referred to in the OSTP. So for us to talk about amending the OSTP and try and put this into concurrence with it.
Yeah, but that's not on the table right now.
Okay, but that's one of the reasons I'm hearing that we would refuse this. And in my opinion, I did a site tour with Lisa Guest, and she showed me the exact outline of where the fence line would be. And the rationale was obviously very well stated in this report. And everything considered, we don't have a lot of options. We probably never will have a lot of options unless it's a new landowner that determines that they're going to put this type of land, put this type of amenity into a new subdivision. But then with such a restrictive distance requirement, you're going to be tying up a lot of land that's probably not reasonable even in the future. So based on the site tour that I did, and based on the fact that most people that live in Canmore in those locations now, there's a lot of condominiumized opportunities there, so they don't have backyards. They don't have a place to take their dogs off leash. And when I first moved to Canmore, we had backyards. People could run their dogs in their backyard, or take them out into the corridors, which didn't actually exist at the time, but now we know that there's this wildlife interface we have to deal with. So we're dealing with more density, less personal amenities. I think this is absolutely the time that we need to approve a group amenity like this, because we have 1,480 licensed dogs in Canmore, and a lot of retired people move to the community with dogs. It's a fact of life now that more people are raising dogs than kids. And so the fact is that I think with a group amenity like this, in this location, it's not huge, it's not overbearing in the sense that there's going to be thousands of dogs in this location. I think a lot of people will walk their dog to that location and run it around as if they had a backyard, which a lot of them don't have anymore. So I would actually approve this particular amenity in this location for the people in that neighborhood that would appreciate it.
Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll keep it short. Great opinions, folks. I enjoyed that. My only comment is, I guess, through to administration and Mr. Orr, your hands are tied for doing enforcement up there. I recognize that. The province doesn't seem to want, well, they probably don't have conservation officers to deal with this. I wonder at some point in the future if administration could be exploring expanding the peace officer appointments for Mr. Orr and his staff to be able to do enforcement in the wildlife corridors. That used to exist, but I might be dating myself that something's been changed. But were that the case, that we could get them appointed under Parks Act, under Wildlife Act, it would take a little bit of the heat off and address what's obviously an epidemic problem.
Just to that point, Councillor, that's likely to be a part of the conversation at the roundtable process that the MLA and I have just started, is exactly to that effect. Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I too did a site walkthrough, and I was reasonably happy with the sites. When you take a look at the open space and trails plan, that's a bit of a problem for me because of the distance. But another thing that we have to look at is a third-party review for the Palliser lands. It came back to say that we're not managing that wildlife course, wildlife section very well. There's off-leash dogs going in, and we need to do something to mitigate that. Putting a dog park right there, it'd be temporary and everything else, but it would certainly go a long way to mitigating that problem that's right now and real. Up in Hubman, I did the walkthrough. We worked with people to design it and everything else, and I thought it was reasonable. There wasn't a lot wrong with it, and we do need to do something. I think if we're asking for enforcement and we're not providing reasonable alternatives for our citizens, that behavior is going to continue. Some people do like to walk their dogs off leash or even on leash and ride bikes. We might be able to create some trails and everything else to address that as well. But the simple thing of creating dog parks when you have wildlife corridors and habitat patches are very important. I don't, we're going to have to make a decision today, and I think we should bring the open space and trails plan back for review. So we might get a different result when we take a look at that further.
Councillor Krause.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, thank you. My experience being on the Human Use Management Review itself, through these discussions about what we do about this particular issue, the top things that we need to do are education and enforcement. Dog parks came along as a suggestion, but I actually, just so that nobody suggests that I was supportive of one thing at one time and something else another time, I brought up during those discussions that they had to be appropriate, an appropriate alternative to what was happening in the wildlife corridors. They had to be a similar experience. They had to provide that real alternative, and so I did speak to those. But I'm very much supportive that we have to have more enforcement, and whether that's in conjunction with the province or something of our own, it's going to have a cost to it. But if we really want to deal with this problem, that's where we need to be spending our money, is in enforcement.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. So education, enforcement, and facilities. And I think that everyone at this table has been stating, as we've been campaigning the last couple of months, and what we've been talking about, especially since happenings in our wild spaces this summer, is that we want to provide facilities for people. And yeah, I agree that people go out in the wildlife corridors and then they exercise their dogs, but I also see them go out there and just go for a walk and come around back. So I think that if this even takes a dozen dogs out of the corridors, it's worthwhile. This land is MR. It's for community use. This is an appropriate community use, and I'll be approving it, voting in favor of it.
Councillor Comfort.
So in the past, Councillor Krause has persuaded me one way, and this time Councillor McCallum and Councillor Sanford. It's been a long couple of weeks.
4 years.
Yeah, I know. What's your name next to me? I agree. The remark about backyard was particularly appropriate for the number of people as our communities get more dense and they don't have a backyard. And I know a lot of people come home after work and they just want to go for a walk with the dog before they go for dinner. And I don't really, having done the tours and having heard both sides, I think it's, again, an appropriate use. And I think we need to do this. I think we need to start providing things for people with dogs, and I think we need to use the full suite of tools in our toolbox, as some people like to say, everything that's in there, and that includes dog parks. If we want to live with wildlife, we have to provide that alternative and change behavior. So I will vote for this.
Further discussion on the motion, which is to approve the installation of the off-leash dog park at Hubman. If there's no further discussion, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's approved with Councillors Russell, Krauser, and Mayor Borman in opposition. That then I will move that Council approve the installation of the off-leash dog park at Palliser. And I will speak briefly to this motion. My concerns around the open space trail plans applies to this motion as well, but more so, I just simply don't feel that, given all of the factors that go into selecting these facilities and making them functional in our community, I think this particular location is not great. It's far too close to the Blackiston building, and there is no trees or any sort of anything to block the views. The slides, the images that were shown of the other proposed sites clearly had a lot of screening in place, and that wouldn't be as large a concern. But I would much rather find another option up on that side of the highway to move forward with an off-leash dog park over there. So I will again vote against this motion. Councillor Krauser.
I'll also oppose this motion, but for the added reason that it's interim. And I don't want us to have to then build up some patrons of this facility, only to tell them that it's gone later. I also reiterate what I said before. I do not think that this meets or solves the problem that we have. Taking 12 dogs out of the wildlife corridor is just a tip of the iceberg, and really I don't think we get as much bang for our buck as if we go after and enforce the penalties that are there.
Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just don't. I don't believe this is a good location for an off-leash park. I was provided some photos. I'm not sure if procedure-wise if I can just pass them along or whatever the case, but it is a regular elk. It is a regular elk grazing area. They're in there, and it's multi-seasonal. So I just not in favor of this one at all.
Councillor Seeley.
I will support it because it does speak to the third-party review that we had, and we need to do something specifically there. So it does aid in that, and it's temporary, so we can see how it goes. I don't know how long it would be there, but it certainly provides a temporary solution to a big problem.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Well, I too will support this location. It again provides people who have high density living with a backyard option. It's not very big, but it's big enough to run your dog around for 20 minutes and get that dog off leash. I know that we've talked in the past about people walking out of the Blakiston and going up the hillside into the corridors because that's more pleasant and easier. But if they had a fenced option, I think you might see more people using that because you can run your dog in the fenced option. Whereas if you're in a corridor, you're going to have to keep a little bit more control over your dog. And it does impact the corridor. So let's give people the option. If there's another development built there where dogs are allowed, we're going to have to provide some opportunity for those people to take their dogs too. So I would approve this location as well.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you. So yes, it is a temporary use, which in this case actually allows us to decide down the road whether we want to keep it there or if we're going to move it somewhere else. As it was brought up prior, there's going to be 150 units of housing that are going to be added to this particular district, and those people will probably come with dogs. And I would say that that site is almost as close to those homes. Well, it's not much farther away actually than the corridor is, and people are looking in their back windows watching people's dogs poo in the corridor. So at least there'd be a fence. And maybe we could put some frustration barrier too there if people are frustrated by the pooing. So yes, I will be supporting this one as well.
Councillor Comfort.
I will also support this for reasons previously mentioned, and speaking to the interim use, it sounds like we will get lots of notice that when the site will be needed for housing, and also to get we know about the heavy use in that corridor. And as to the elk, I think we understand that we don't want them on the highway. We don't want them, it would be better if we could somehow mitigate them up above, get it back up above that site. So I think leaving it open perhaps is not the best idea. And those people who live there and who have dogs would greatly appreciate this. And again, it's a neighborhood amenity. It's not a big deal. So.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question then on approving the installation of the off-leash dog park at the Palliser location. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried with Councillors Russell, Krausert, and Mayor Borman in opposition. And with that, then I will move, or we'll call a short break.
Will you be bringing forward your follow-up motion regardless about the open trails plan for review?
May as well put it out there. Sure, I'll move that council direct administration to bring the open space and trails plan to council for review as soon as practical in the new year. Discussion on that motion, Councillor McCallum. Councillor Krausert.
Thank you, Your Worship. I don't think that that's necessary. That was just approved in 2015. To bring it back for one decision, it feels like trying to make things fit. And I just don't think that that's the good use of administration's time right now, especially since there's so many things on their plate.
Further discussion on that motion? Councillor, did you have anything else? Councillor McCallum?
Want me to talk? I'll talk.
No, I don't actually. I want to get a break.
I think that it would be prudent for us to take a look at what other walls we might end up, whatever other situations we might have engineered ourselves into accidentally. And it's just a review. It doesn't even have to come to council, but it would be nice to have a look at it again through a second set of eyes. We are going to be developing our community differently than other communities. And so the same best practices that happen in other regular towns is not the same best practices that we're going to be using. And to quote other people in the gallery that like to use this term, we need to come up with more made in Canmore solutions. And I think that reviewing the open trails plan is another way of reviewing it, is a way of making sure that we haven't engineered ourselves into a corner.
And I will support my motion as well for reasons I've stated previously, but the direction in the open space trails plan runs contrary to what our vision and our intent and goals are. So I think we should at some time, and I don't think this is high priority, but at some time there could be just a discussion about that and perhaps some other terms in that plan. Councillor Krausert?
So one of the things that we're developing as a best practice is that when something goes onto the plate, when the plate's already full, we have to talk about what's going off of the plate. And so I think that we have an incomplete reference in front of us as to put something onto administration's plate in 2018 when it's already well underway what that plan looks like. So I think that this is terribly premature and not needed, given that it's only been 2 years.
And just to your point, which I take, it's a good point. I was thinking that this might be a very easy discussion at in the new year when council engages in the long-term business planning for the next year. It's not to interrupt currently approved work.
So my question is shouldn't we leave it to that council at that time to decide if something needs to be done in conversation with administration at that time?
That's a good question. You can show your support for one direction or another through a vote. Councillor McCallum, did you have something else?
Well, even though we've approved a 2-year budget, we have stated that we can look and will look at that budget after the election. So instead of asking administration, in the spirit of Councillor Krausert's recommendation, would it be better for us to refer this matter to the Budget Committee post-election to see how it may or may not fit into the 2018 budget plans?
Doesn't matter to me.
So what was, I don't see your motion, so is there a motion?
It's just to direct administration to bring the open space trails plan to council for review in the new year.
So then I would amend that.
We're making something.
Well, if you put it up on the screen, then it won't be on the fly, please.
Well, it was on the fly.
So I fly your fly.
I'll leave the motion to stand as I gave it and let it stand or fail, and council can move on from there.
Okie doke.
So I will call the question on the motion, which I think everybody understands. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried with councillors Krausert and Sanford in opposition. And now I will call a short break. Call the meeting back to order. And we're turning now to item G3, Development Permit 2017-144 for a 90-unit multifamily apartment development located at 521 Old Canmore Road. Did I jump ahead?
Yeah. Way to go.
Beg pardon. We'll move to I'm just trying to get through this evening. Besides, Mr. Hannon's in the room. He's dying to get to that issue. Okay, we'll then consider agenda item G2, development permit number 2017-153 for a 148-unit multifamily rental and employee housing development at 1451 Palliser Trail. The podium is yours, sir.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. To begin with, administration has an updated Schedule A for council's consideration. The final variance included in the Schedule A in the agenda package does not reflect administration's recommendation, and therefore an updated Schedule A has been prepared for you. Thank you, Councillor Krausert, for catching the error. This application is the second development permit as part of the project's two-phase approval. Council will remember that they approved DP 2017-080 back in July to allow for the construction of servicing, grading, and foundation work at the site. That permit also dealt with steep creek hazard, site coverage, and building setbacks. Briefly, a bit of site context for you. As you likely recall, the site is adjacent to the Trans-Canada Highway and off-ramp. Vacant properties surround the site. Nearby developments include the Hector and Blackstone residential developments, the Holiday Inn, and the soon-to-be constructed Catholic Church. As well, council is aware that the Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor is also nearby. The site has its own direct control district. The proposed 140 units of rental housing is a permitted use in the district, while the 8 units, 40 beds, of employee housing is a discretionary use. With the exception of 4 requested variances, the proposed development complies with the requirements of the DC district and other pertinent sections of the land use bylaw. Taking a look at the proposed site plan with respect to parking, as required by the district, the proposed development includes 210 surface vehicular parking stalls, 1 loading bay, and 148 bicycle parking stalls, 112 of which are outdoor and 36 inside, and are just highlighted on the slide there. With regards to site circulation, the proposed vehicular circulation is adequate to allow for emergency access and waste pickup services. There are 2 proposed accesses, 1 primary and 1 emergency. A traffic impact assessment was completed for this application. The assessment concluded that no intersections concluded that intersections will continue to operate at an acceptable level of service and that no improvements are required as a result of the proposed development. The proposed pedestrian circulation is also adequate, allowing occupants pathway access between buildings, pathway access to on-site open and playground space, and access to the town's trail network along Palliser Trail via pedestrian crosswalks. This development is required to provide a 12-meter wide landscaping strip as measured from the property line. The strip runs adjacent to the highway and off-ramp, as seen in the slide, highlighted in green. The applicant has encroached into a portion of this area with parking stalls requiring a variance to the location of landscaping. This variance will be discussed later in the presentation. The applicant has provided significantly more, approximately 80% more on-site landscaping as shown in the slide, and its landscaping totals over 5,000 square meters in area. With that, the proposed landscaping provides slightly different height and tree type ratios than what's required by the bylaw. However, given the applicant has provided substantially more landscaping, administration feels the intent of the landscaping ratios and height requirements have been met. The proposed development includes a playground area and structures designed for 5 to 12-year-olds. The applicant will purchase and install the structures, but the town will maintain them as part of its playground inventory. The structures proposed meet our playground standards. Maintenance of the structures will have a small increase in the operational budget of the Parks Department beginning in 2009. The intent of this arrangement is to ensure proper maintenance of the playground and to expand and complement the network of available amenities for children in the area. For example, the Blackstone development has a playground, as you saw in the previous presentation, that's geared for ages between 2 and 5. Finally, with respect to the site plan, during the rezoning process, concerns were expressed that residential development may result in an increase in the number of pedestrians crossing the Trans-Canada Highway. To address this concern, the applicant is proposing a post and rail fence, as shown in the slide, adjacent to the Trans-Canada Highway and along the sides of the property. So you can't see, it just runs all the way along the back there. While this type of fence is passable by pedestrians and cyclists with some difficulty, it will have some effect and reinforce that crossing the highway is discouraged. A traditional residential fence design was considered, however, given the desire to cross the highway, the fence would likely be damaged on an ongoing basis to allow for passage through, and this damage would look unsightly. Moving on to the buildings, looking at the design of the proposed buildings, all 3 buildings are 4 stories and are at or below the maximum permitted building height in the district, which is 16 meters. The proposed buildings have distinct main entrances, at-grade patios for buildings 1 and 2 that help to create more activity along the front and rear yard, facade articulation, roof elements that break up the roof massing, and material and color variations that create interest. The proposed development does include non-compliant roof pitches for each building and the use of vinyl siding as the main building material, both resulting in a variance or variances that will be discussed later in this presentation. Although there are no developments directly adjacent to the site, the proposed buildings do relate to and integrate with the Hector and Blackstone residential buildings further down Palliser Trail. As you can see on the slide, their roof peaks are similar, as well as the number of stories and building colors. So having a look at the proposed variances, as I mentioned, a variance to roof pitch is required. The development is required to have a minimum 612 roof pitch design. The applicant is proposing 512 for each building for the main roof line. This decrease in pitch can increase the perceived mass of a building when viewed from the street or adjacent development, as the eave line height increases, exposing more building face. Administration believes the impact of this variance is minimal, as buildings 1 and 2 include decorative roof peaks in the front and back that are steep and help to break up the massing. So you can see here they've got these big decorative peaks. And on the right here is a picture of development with compliant roof pitches. So the area that requires a variance is right here. As you can see, it's very difficult to tell the difference between the 512 pitch and the 612 pitch.
So the one on the right, the Blackstone, is the 512?
612.
612.
Yeah, and the one on the left is what Northview is proposing, and it's these sections here that are 512 pitch, whereas the decorative roof pitches are compliant with the bylaw. They're greater than 612. So it sort of helps break up the massing, so you don't really even notice the 512. As mentioned, the applicant proposes the encroachment of approximately 6 parking stalls within the required landscaping area, resulting in a variance. These encroachments were required in order for the applicant to accommodate some of administration's requested site improvements, such as the raised pathway that connects Building 1 with the rear open space, while still meeting their on-site parking requirements. So essentially, we asked them to put in this pathway right here, eliminate some stalls, and just allow for easier access for Building 1 to get to that green space. Administration believes the impact of the variance is minimal, given that there is additional landscaping in the rear. So the darker green color is outside of that 12-meter strip, and that's about 3 times the area of the encroachment. So this area is a benefit, I guess, to the residents because it's larger, it's more accessible, and we believe it'll be, as a result of those, used more, and therefore support the variance.
What did you say the total area of landscaping is?
It's over 5,000 square meters for the site. In terms of the encroachment area,
so
here.
5,000 square meters, that's It's more than an acre, isn't it? 5,000 times 2. 5,000 square meters. Translate that into real measurements for me.
It's close to an acre.
So there's an acre of landscaping. Isn't that the whole parcel only? What's the whole parcel?
The parcel is...
Pardon me?
Trying to confirm those numbers for you. Perhaps I can report back.
I thought the...
3,000 square feet.
Pardon me?
5,000 meters.
Yeah. So the parcel was 2.5 acres, wasn't it? 4 acres? So we're saying a quarter of the parcel is landscaped. Huh. Okay then. Sorry, move on.
That's great. No, we got that addressed. So the application also requires a eave projection variance. There's a couple of eaves. You can see them highlighted in red here on the slide that project further than what's typically allowed. So the corner of the building here projects, the eave projects 37 centimeters further. This one projects 19 centimeters further. And this eave line here projects 7 centimeters further. Administration believes the impact of the variance is minimal. The areas of increased eave projection are small and should not have any measurable impact on adjacent development. Finally, with respect to variances, the land use bylaw provides a list of acceptable and unacceptable building materials for the use with new development. Quality materials and finishes are important. The applicant has proposed use of vinyl siding. If you look on the slide here, the red material is vinyl, the cedar or wood colored material is vinyl, and the blue color is vinyl. So a significant portion of the each building's facade is made up of vinyl. Vinyl siding is considered to be a low quality material that is not aesthetically durable. For example, while it can look attractive when it's newly installed, over time it begins to fade or degrade. Administration recommends that Council approve this application conditional that the applicant submit drawings that propose building materials that are compliant with the requirements of the land use bylaw. The rationale for administration not supporting the variance is due to the following. This is one of the most visible sites in the community, and therefore it's not an appropriate place to sacrifice building material quality. Community members and developers have bought into the importance of using quality materials, and it would be difficult to justify this relaxation without impacting fairness and commitment. And finally, high quality materials were required by the town on other affordable housing projects, including the Hector as well as the old daycare site development.
So the Schedule A, Attachment 3, has to be amended to remove variance number 4, is that right?
That's what's been amended, yes.
Yeah, so we're not approving the project with vinyl.
Unless you want to, yes.
I don't want to.
Okay, okay. Well, we'll have that discussion.
Just want to make that clear, thanks.
Okay. In accordance with the DC district, an environmental impact statement is required to be prepared. The applicant's EIS was completed in 2 phases, as you remember, to represent the 2 development approvals. Phase 1 EIS addressed the effects, mitigation, and monitoring of the construction of the foundations and underground works and above ground structures of the development, and was accepted by Council as part of DP 2017-080. Outstanding items identified as needing to be addressed included baseline noise data, which has been addressed, elk displacement dynamics, specifically concerns regarding vehicular collisions, and baseline conditions of the Silvertip Lower Wildlife Corridor, both of which have been addressed through the town's commitment to a multi-jurisdictional management plan for the Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor. Phase 2 EIS addresses the effects from the operation and maintenance of the development, including increased human use and effects on wildlife. The EIS indicates that the project should not generate any serious risks to the environmental components evaluated. However, it does specify that there is a level of uncertainty given the lack of available data with some of the predicted outcomes, for example, elk displacement and the current functionality of the Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor. The EIS suggests that these concerns should be addressed through implementing the proposed mitigation measures, such as Wild Smart education for residents, among others. The mitigation measures suggested in the EIS have been added as a condition of approval within the Schedule A. The EIS also recommends components that should be included in the multi-jurisdictional management plan that the town is undertaking for the Silvertip Wildlife Corridor. For example, the need for improved data collection and adaptive monitoring. Administration will consider these recommendations as part of that process. The town's consultant completed a third-party review of the EIS. The review indicated that the proposed mitigation and monitoring in the EIS are sufficient to minimize negative effects of the development. Conditional on, for the construction phase, Northview contacting Alberta Environment and Protection to determine if any actions are required as a result of the delayed construction activities, possibly extending into the wildlife restricted activity periods. Northview has indicated that they will adhere to this recommendation. Also, for the operation and maintenance phase, Northview clearly defining the mitigation and monitoring commitments related to the effects of their development on the functionality of the lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor and human-wildlife interactions. Northview has clearly identified their mitigation commitments, although the consultant indicated they would have liked to have seen more monitoring commitments. Finally, 3 regional mitigation and monitoring plans to reduce the cumulative effects from existing, proposed, and future developments and the associated increased human use in the Palliser area and wildlife need to be addressed by the multi-jurisdictional management plan. The Environmental Advisory Review Committee reviewed Phase 2 EIS for completeness, adherence to the terms of reference. They identified areas where issues had not been explicitly addressed, but overall felt that the EIS responded to the intent of the Phase 2 scope. Additional comments from ERC included to consider fencing along the Trans-Canada Highway, an off-leash dog park in the area, and that the developer consider making the building pet-free. So in conclusion, given the proposed variants are not impactful or minimal impact on adjacent developments, and that the EIS concludes that the impact on the reviewed environmental components is minimal, administration recommends approval of DP 2017-153, conditional on new architectural drawings submitted that are compliant with the land use bylaws building material requirements. This concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you. Well, we've talked a lot about this project over the months. It's good that we've gotten to this point where we're actually talking about the finer details. So there will be a revised motion prepared for the overhead that references variance 4. Not that it matters. I can. Okay. All right. It was interesting to know it's not that relevant to this decision, but the third-party review noted that the lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor is not really functioning. I think that'll fuel some future discussion, or it should fuel some future discussion, not specific to this project. Just it was interesting, not at all surprising to note that. Did you have a comment? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. I was really impressed at how much the proponent was trying to meet the obligations of the EIS, or the recommendations, any kind of recommendations that were made. One of the things on my agenda, page 251, there's a mention of mitigation and monitoring, and it says the proponent to use landscape materials that will not attract wildlife pursuant to the Town of Canmore Construction and Landscaping Standards, Town of Canmore 2016. But when I go to the Town of Canmore Landscaping Standards, there's a lot of things in there that are attractants. So if I go to the WildSmart standards, or the recommended vegetation that WildSmart has on their page, they've actually eliminated things that are attractants. So I'm wondering if we can maybe put that into better alignment of what are attractants and what aren't attractants, because what they're referring to has some attractants in it.
Sure,
Do you
absolutely.
understand what I mean?
Yeah.
Because they're really trying to achieve a good measure of monitoring and mitigation. I mean, they're trying to keep the animals out of there, but what they're referring to actually includes attractants.
Absolutely.
So if we can go to a higher standard, which is the Wild Smart standard?
Absolutely, we can do that. They're obligated to meet the commitments in the EIS, so
Yeah.
they absolutely can.
And it's not hard to do because it's very similar, but we might as well go to the highest standard because it's new. Okay?
Absolutely.
All right, thanks.
Councillor Comfort.
I just wondered, in the IRC recommendations, was that the developer consider making the building pet-free, which would eliminate the whole problem of the dog park. So I just wondered, is that something that we could demand of the developer, that that building be pet-free? Or any building, what kinds of restrictions can we put?
I don't think we have the power to restrict animals within the development, but I will defer to Mr. Fish on that one.
Yeah, that would have to be something that we would have to be done contractually through an agreement with the owner of the property. This isn't something that has come up previously or prior to IRC's comments. The initial response was that it could significantly impact their potential rental pool of potential clients that they are expecting. So it would reopen a significant negotiation.
Okay, thank you. I was just curious about that.
Do you have any other questions at this time? Just have one observation, no question really, just an observation. You know, when it comes to discouraging people from crossing the Trans-Canada Highway, it seems to me that if the Trans-Canada Highway in and of itself isn't deterrent enough, nothing will be. I mean, that's a road with a lot of big trucks, and so a fence, yeah, okay, not going to do anything, but we will be having a discussion at some point in the future about some sort of pedestrian crossing, so that'll be good in the future. Councillor McCallum, you have a question?
You invoked the question I wanted to ask, which was about the fencing and about whether there's going to be any signage accompanying that fencing.
What, don't cross the highway, that kind of
Well,
fence?
it's against the law to cross the highway, is it not? That's the right answer. So perhaps a sign reminding people that it's against the law to cross the highway makes people more aware of the laws that they're breaking in advance of breaking them. I don't know.
Okay.
Education, enforcement.
So currently all that's proposed is the fence, but if council would like, they could certainly add a condition.
You're not suggesting that be a condition for the...
No, but I just think it's something that we have similar signage, I believe, that CP has put up along the railway, correct? Stop looking at me like you're a deer, right?
Yes, there is trespassing across the CP railway. So there are laws against that.
Yeah, and there's signage that highlights that law.
The Trans-Canada is not private land, so it's not subject to the same regulations as the CPR tracks. There is quite extensive talk about education as part of trying to mitigate some of the, to create some education around the wildlife corridor. So it's possible that we could talk to the building operator about including messages around not crossing the highway as well, and potentially including some signage there.
That'd be great, thank you. Sorry about the deer thing.
Yeah, okay. Is there any other questions this time? Seeing none, thanks for your presentation. So, there's an amended motion. Yeah, so the motion will be, yeah. So I'll move the council approve development permit number 2017-153, subject to the conditions of approval set out in Schedule A, amended to remove the proposed variance number 4 regarding wall finishing and to not permit vinyl. That's clear enough. Discussion on the motion. I'll speak briefly. This is a project that's come along fairly quickly, and I appreciate the work that Mr. Fark and his planning team have done to make this move along smartly, and I also appreciate the cooperation that we've had right from the start from Northview REIT. This project supplying 148 units of purpose-built rental is going to make a huge difference to our community and to our housing situation. So kudos to you all, and I'm happy to support the development permit at this point. Other discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Yeah, we might bog down on this next one. Item G3. Development permit number 2017-144 for a 90-unit multifamily apartment development located at 521 Old Canmore Road, the Coast Apartment. Ms. Rogers.
Sorry, we're just going to be one moment during the break. The computer was
voted differently. Good evening, Mayor and Council. The proposal before you tonight is for a 90-unit multifamily apartment building. This is a market rental building with surface and underground parking. Located at 521 Old Canmore Road, it is the district is the Coast Apartment Direct Control District that was approved by Council in 2015. The Development Authority is the Town of Canmore Municipal Council. For context, the proposed development is located between the Coast Hotel and the Trans-Canada Highway. Recent development on Old Canmore Road includes a brewery, Grizzly Paw, located across from Coast Apartments. In addition, a development permit for Shops at Canmore is located immediately across from Lot 30, the Coast Hotel, and that was approved by CPC recently. It's an interesting site. It's got an interesting context, a number of challenges, and some specific goals in mind. Lot 31, the Coast Apartments, is accessed from Old Canmore Road through an easement provided by adjacent Lot 30 through the Coast Hotel property. The proposed 5-story building will house all the units and is located toward the rear of the site in part to the property's unusual configuration, including a utility facility identified as a right-of-way plan, noted on the drawing. The plan needs to, and as well as the existing staff accommodation, which is also on Lot 30 as part of the Coast Hotel. The plan needs to address waste and recycling pickup, emergency services, requirements for water service looping to support fire flow in the area. In addition, requirements for a strong pedestrian focus throughout the site and access to the Lot 7MR trail. This drawing, the orange shows the pedestrian circulation through the site. Given the location and site constraints, the site plan is practical, attractive, and addresses land use bylaw expectations well. The main pedestrian access through the site is, for the most part, a 2.5 meter wide paved walkway system
This is consistent with the town's goal of encouraging comfortable pedestrian and cycling systems. Site residents and those who live and visit south of the site may readily walk or cycle to shops and services of Bow Valley Trail and the town center. The trail system that will be provided by the development on Lot 7MR is fully accessible by site residents, the Coast Hotel, and those south of the site. Vehicular waste recycling and emergency access is from Old Canmore Road. The private road south on the adjacent property will have an emergency access gate, restricting the site from vehicular shortcutting. The proposed parkade entrance is located adjacent to the MR. The site provides some good amenities and are consistent with the land use bylaw. The building is offset, helping to break up the building massing. There are 18 units on each of the 5 floors. Each floor has 8 one-bedroom units and 10 two-bedroom units. The building conforms to the district height of 21 meters. To manage the massing and scale, details include building orientation such that the narrow portion faces is adjacent to the TCH. Excuse me. Architectural features and colors that provide a distinctive look and visually mitigate the size. The building has finishes that include a stone veneer base, a middle consisting of a mix of hardy plank siding and stucco, and a main roof that has a 9 to 12 gable roof, sloped gable roof. In addition, the stucco and hardy plank are visually separated by the introduction of a heavy timber sunshade along the front or the main entrance side of the building. In addition to the building offset, the massing is addressed horizontally through the use of a change in stucco color combined with recessed decks and the inclusion of what I'm calling a 312 rotated shed roof break, and I hope the architect doesn't mind me calling it that. But the application, as you can see, conforms to the land use bylaw in many important areas. There are some variances required for eave, projection, and parking. The total parking stall numbers are not the same as provided in the council report. The variance is 8, not 4. And just to be clear, the variances are based on new information received 8 p.m. Wednesday of last week. And so we apologize for any of the confusion. The good news is that the consulting team has responded well to administration comments on the initial submission, and we are happy with the results. So in conclusion, due to the site constraints, underground services, fire flow, emergency services, waste, recycle pickup, and parkade entrance, as well as the land use bylaw expectations around landscaping and pedestrian focus, the location is very walkable. It has ready access to transit and a trail system. From a livability perspective, it has a good amenity space, and it has practical solutions that are also attractive. And it provides much needed rental housing in the town of Canmore. There are some amendments to Schedule A, and I can bring up a tracked version of that for you. It clarifies and updates the parking variance wording and adds the eave projection variance for 2 locations, one in the northeast corner and one at the southwest corner of the building. So, per the requirements of the Coast Department's Direct Control District, Council is the approving authority, and we request that Council approve DP 2017-144, subject to the conditions of approval set out in Schedule A. With that, take your questions.
So
oh, yes, I can do it too.
And Schedule A needs to be amended, is that right?
Right. So,
okay. So parking variance permit 84 stalls, a variance of 8 stalls, okay.
Correct.
And what's that second bit? Right corner. Okay. Can we just refresh our memories about the discussion some time ago around parking relaxation on the site, and there was concern that if the property was condominiumized, we'd lose the advantage of the long-term rentals, and so there was the reduced parking. What was the reduced parking that we approved initially?
If I understand the question, if the units are condominiumized, there is an expectation that the unit parking meets the bylaw, the other requirements of the bylaw. It's not exactly how you phrase it.
Yes, Ms. Rogers is correct. If the building were to be condominiumized and units individually owned, then there would be a different parking requirement for that kind of development that would result in significantly more parking being required.
Yeah, so this in a way adds even better certainty that it's unlikely that it would be condominiumized because it's another 8 stalls that would be required.
That's correct. Should unforeseen circumstances occur, the owner of the property would have the ability to come to council and seek some kind of consideration or relaxation given specific circumstances, but that would be up to council to decide in the future should that hopefully unlikely scenario occur.
Thank you. Councillor Krausert.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thanks for the presentation. And just so I understand, those aren't the only amendments to the DP as well. There's one in paragraph 14, I believe.
Right. That just clarifies, again, clarifies the parking.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah, it clarifies the parking. That's correct.
Right. Thank you.
Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Worship. It's not presented anywhere, and it's probably not necessarily part of this issue, but what is planned or what's anticipated to address the increased traffic flow at the intersection of Old Canmore Road and Bow Valley Trail?
So engineering has reviewed the drawings, and there is a plan that I am maybe not as conversant in as I should be, but they have, and in doing their traffic impacts analysis, they included the density being provided by this particular site as well. So it has been addressed in one form or another.
Or is it work in progress, I guess, more so?
The traffic impact assessment that was done in part with, I think it was related to upgrading Railway Avenue and shops and the inclusion of shops of Canmore.
Okay.
That traffic impact study also included the 90 units from this particular development.
Thank you.
So just for my own sake, the attachment 2, Schedule A, point number 1 will be amended to read parking variance to permit 84 stalls, a variance of 8 stalls.
Correct.
And point number 2 is...
Point number 2 is a variance to the eaves, one at the northeast corner of the site, so right next to the MR.
So that's in addition to the Schedule A we have here. It's not a change.
Yes, it's in addition. We received a plot plan late last week, and that identified that particular variance.
And then the change in item 14?
Yeah, item 14 clarifies what the parking, what the actual parking is. So 4 visitor stalls, which meets the requirements of the district. 80 unit parking stalls for a total of 84, plus 45 protected bicycle parking stalls.
So requirement in the past for 4 barrier-free stalls is gone.
The barrier-free stalls are a requirement of the Alberta Building Code, and they are included in the total.
So we don't need to reference that in Schedule A. Okay. And for the sake of the minutes, I mean, the report doesn't, if somebody's looking back in the future to this agenda item, how will they see that those changes were made to Schedule A unless it's specified in the motion?
I think we should specify it in the motion. I'm envisioning the wording saying to approve the Schedule A with the following amendments shown, and I'll show them in strike out and underline. And then if you were comparing it back to the agenda package, you could see which words were added and which were deleted. Does that sound all right?
Yes. So we don't need to specify all of those changes in the motion itself?
No, I'll do it in the, I have the whole Schedule A reproduced in the minutes, so I'll make the changes in that and I'll show which changes we made.
Okay.
Yeah.
Someone will have to check that you did that before they sign the minutes.
Yes, if Councillor Krauser could maybe check.
Okay. Are there other questions? Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Very beautiful project. Could you tell me, are the bicycle parking provided based on a calculation that we demand, and has it been amplified at all? Because I just remember hearkening back to the building of Elevation Place, and Gary Buxton, who is no longer here at the town of Canmore, insisting that there was more than enough bike parking, and it was clearly not enough. And he is a bicycle enthusiast, so.
Right. So the district sets out a half bicycle parking stall per unit, and this application meets that requirement as approved by council in 2015.
Gotcha.
To be fair, I think we will be seeing some changes in the future with some higher expectations. Both engineering and planning are supporting additional parking, bicycle parking.
Yeah, if I go to neighborhoods in Canmore where there's multi-family builds, the one thing I see in addition to, well, the one thing I see is bicycle parking badly needed. Right. And I think we want to make sure our kids go to school on bikes and everything else. We need to provide them with facilities. So I don't personally think that 45 stalls is adequate, but if it's something that we already agreed to, is it something that we already agreed to?
Yeah, I don't know if the architect wishes to speak to any of that. There's a significant amount of storage in the parkade.
Okay.
For residents. I think that one or two bikes could probably be stored there.
Could you come up?
You have to come and speak to the folks at home. Lucky you. And thank you for answering my question.
No problem. We have bicycle storage in the parkade itself, as well as covered outdoor parking, and all of the cubicles or storage compartments for each of the units have enough space in them for at least one, if not two bikes. So I think we have pretty reasonable coverage. Okay. If you consider that half a bicycle would easily fit.
Because I'd leave my crappy townie outside, but some people might want to lock theirs away.
Right. Fair enough.
Thank you very much.
I think we have good coverage. Thank you.
Councillor Sanford?
Sorry, can I just add very quickly to that the general regulations in the town are one bicycle parking stall per 5 vehicle stalls. I was just trying to find it. The specific requirement in this district was significantly higher. in part because of the consideration of the different vehicle parking requirements. So as a trade-off, that was there, and they are already meeting or with the ability of the storage locker exceeding what is required.
I would suggest it's wise of engineering and planning to consider changing that, because I think that tying bicycle parking to vehicle parking doesn't make any sense if we're providing parking variances.
But that's just a suggestion, it's not direction from council.
No. That's...
I've heard there is an amendment to the land use bylaw coming
Really?
soon. So we will
Shut
consider
the front door. As it's my last council meeting, I get to stand on my milk crate and say what I want to say.
All right. Are there any other questions? Oh, Councillor Sanford.
Oh, you're not off the podium yet, Ms. Rogers.
Sorry.
So the previous application we were just talking about, we had a 512 roof, and we were approving that as a variance. So what is this roof? This is quite different.
The roof slope of the main roof is 912.
Okay.
And it does have dormers that pop out at 312, but the bulk of the roof is 912. I can't tell you what percentage that is.
So this conforms to the...
But it conforms to the district.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't look nearly as steep as a 512 roof from this image.
Yeah.
Okay.
I could have shown you a side view of the building as well, and you would see what the slope is.
Okay, so
I can actually do that now.
Is it just the perspective that we have here?
Yeah, because the perspective tends... Okay. When you're taking a perspective from a bird's eye view, you'll see something quite different than if you are walking along the street.
Okay.
So
I'm looking at this one side view, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I can show you the other side view.
Yeah, maybe it would be...
It's on that... it's actually on the... No, it's not the rendering.
That's amazing.
It'll be the elevations. So, sorry, the image on the screen shows the 912 roof pitch. It also shows the that rotated 312 peak that comes popping out. It's not.
So that's what we're looking at. That's what we're evaluating for the pitch, 912?
Okay, then.
Okay.
So the district requires a 612 minimum.
And 912 exceeds that, so we're...
Yes, it does.
Okay, all right. My other question was, again, on page 298, they're showing a list of the landscaping items they're going to use, and they've got a bunch of landscaping items with berries. So can we...
We will check that, yes.
Yeah, could we just avoid the adhere to the attractant management so that it's not berry-producing plants and trees that they're putting up there? And WildSmart has the recommended...
Thank you.
It's easy to do at the beginning. It's a lot harder to do when it's done. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions at this time? Seeing none, thank you very much for your presentation. And I will move the council approve DPA 2017-144, subject to the conditions of approval set out in the amended Schedule A. Discussion on that motion. Quickly, I'll say, just like the last motion, it's a pleasure to be able to approve this and get this project in the ground. This is going to be another really important addition to the long-term rental inventory to meet our needs in Canmore. So I'm looking forward to seeing the groundbreaking occur. Councillor McCallum.
Reiterate, this is exciting. Between the last two agenda items, we've got 238 units of rental housing coming on the market. That's exciting. It's a beautiful building. The layouts of the suites are lovely, and I look forward to visiting my friends in there.
Councillor Krauser.
Thank you, Your Worship. What I especially appreciate about this initiative is that it's a private initiative. I really am pleased about the Palliser initiative, but this one's a private one, and there's a couple things that I wanted to mention. First of all, given the price of land in the town, and as demonstrated by other municipalities who have seen no rental units being built for a while, we do need to go down the road of providing variances that allow, whether it be height, whether it be parking, whatever it is, as we've done here, in order to allow these things to move forward. Because the market, if they're not being built by the market, there's a reason why. And so if we want to change that, we have to change the reasons why, or the barriers. I also want to note that I remember we did hear from some concerned residents nearby about parking, and I just think that that's still another opportunity for a discussion about parking options that can take place in neighborhoods in order to ensure that they have the parking available to them that they need, even though we grow.
Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, I'd like to thank the applicant for bringing this. It's a very important housing stock to the town of Canmore, and being private and everything else, it's wonderful. I don't think we've had an apartment built in Canmore for over 25 years. Go back 40, probably even longer than that. So it's nice to see this sort of product coming to market, and hopefully more will join. And very exciting. Thank you.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor, opposed, motion's carried unanimously. We'll start building. And we've got 13 minutes here, so moving to item G4. Capital Project 1736 for transit bus storage facility improvement. Ms. Medinsky. Better lower that mic a little bit.
I didn't bring a phone book to stand on this time. Good evening, Mayor and Council. For those of you that I've not met, my name is Danica Medinsky, and I work as a project coordinator for the engineering department. I'm here to present the request for decision on Capital Project 1736, which is the bus storage facility improvement. As identified in the request for decision, administration is recommending that we reduce scope for Capital Project 1736 in order to deliver the project within budget as approved by Council. We've worked with Rome Transit and the low compliant bidder on the project in order to develop a reduced scope that provides the items that were identified as priority for Rome Transit within budget as approved by Council. So with that, to kind of keep it short and make room for questions if available or if required, administration requests that the scope of the project be reduced as identified in the request for a decision. We're happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. I always appreciate brief reports at this time of year. Thank you. Just for refreshing memory, the budget, $440,000, brunt of that came from the Green Trip Fund, grant from the province?
That's correct. Yeah.
There are questions this time for Ms. Medinsky? Seeing none, thanks very much for your report. Very straightforward.
Thank you.
And with that, I will move that the project scope be reduced as presented and be delivered within the existing approved budget of $440,000. Discussion on that motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on to item G5, Truth and Reconciliation, calls to action. Dr. Caudle.
Your Worship and members of council, I'm a little torn because I know it's getting late, and this is an item that I don't want it to be rushed. Yeah, well, I don't want it to take a long time either. But I think I will say, as likely you all know, in late December of 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released their final report after 6 years of investigation into residential school systems for Aboriginal peoples of Canada and the legacy of those schools. So 6 years of research, hearing people's stories, understanding truth, and beginning to try to understand what reconciliation might look like. So a significant project. And I will say personally, I'm incredibly proud to be a Canadian citizen in a country that has taken this endeavor so seriously. In November of 2016, the Banff Centre hosted a Truth and Reconciliation Summit that a number of town staff and some members of council attended. And out of that summit and some other things that in particular our staffer Dawn Sanders-Dahl, who's in the Arts and Events Department, were issues she was raising and things she was doing, got a group of us together to begin to talk about what might truth and reconciliation look like for the town of Canmore. Earlier this year, when Council adopted the Tools for the Future, which was the social development strategy for connecting people and community, that report has an entire section on strengthening Indigenous relationships. And so out of that report and the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Summit, the working group, the internal working group, has been just talking about what we could do to move things forward that are consistent with what's happening with the federal government and with the provincial government and what the municipality's role might be. So what's in front of you tonight is our first attempt, or our best attempt so far, at trying to wrestle with the calls to action. There are 94 from the Truth and Reconciliation Summit, and to identify what things might be possible and reasonable for the town of Canmore to do in response to those calls to action. A number of other organizations, government organizations, including the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, have put together documentation outlining commitments of, especially of several larger cities. Communities like Wetaskiwin have commitments from their council to truth and reconciliation. And the city of Calgary has a really, honestly beautiful document, an Indigenous policy framework that was done through a concerted committee effort. So this is certainly not a beautiful document by any stretch, but it is a concerted effort of staff. In addition, there is a Truth and Reconciliation group that is meets across the Bow Valley. We're trying to meet 3 times a year, talking about basically initiatives that each individual group has on the go, making sure that we're not duplicating efforts, trying to make sure that we have Indigenous representation at the table and that what people are working on is actually meaningful in Indigenous communities and to Indigenous people, not our ideas of what they need us to do. So if Council is to approve this document tonight, we would take this document both to elders and the Youth Council of the Stoney Nakoda for their feedback and input, as well as to that regional working group for their input. So it would meant to be a living document. And again, this is just our best attempt at looking at the calls to action, trying to understand where the municipality might fit and what we could reasonably move forward. Right now, there is no budget ask. This approval is just for planning purposes, but the idea is that anytime, if there ever were anything, and honestly, if there ever were anything, it would come to council as part of a budget process for approval. Everything else right now listed is largely things that we can do with current resources and through partnership. So with that, I'll leave it to you if you have any questions.
I don't have too many questions, but I have to say I'm impressed with this report. It's very comprehensive, and it's also good to note, it's important to note that so many of the proposed actions are relatively simple and can be done within currently approved budget and without taxing staff resources. So yeah, this is really good. Councillor Comfort?
I'd echo that, and thank you for bringing this forward. As you know, it's close and dear to my heart. I would like to request that after those meetings, 3 times a year, could a report be made to Committee of the Whole just within the Should have been report that comes forward?
Absolutely.
I'd really appreciate seeing
Yep,
that.
happy to.
Thank you.
Councillor Crowsert.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Dr. Cottle, for the presentation. Just to save time later, when the motion's made and I support it, I'm going to be doing so quite proudly as well. I do want a clarification, and just so that it's understood. For example, under Action 14, Language and Culture, it's on 319 of our package, where it says future budget request. So that is just to be clear that it's going to be entirely up to that future council at that time to determine whether there's the funds to go ahead with any particular project. It's not
Absolutely, yes. Anything that requires future budget requests would have to come to council for approval. And again, the things listed here are really right now just our ideas. It's completely possible that when we take this to chat with Stoney and Nakota, that they say, you know, that's not something that's actually meaningful to us. So we wouldn't pursue it if it wasn't something that was meaningful and reasonably affordable and easy, or not easy, but you know, we wouldn't want to put up, we have great signage, we don't want to create all kinds of maintenance issues. So it would need to be consistent with all those things.
So that leads to the other question right at that same page there. Where appropriate, translate signage and just only where appropriate. What sort of things would be looked at as to?
So budget would be where appropriate. Again, meaningfulness and also, frankly, space. Some of our short words are quite long for them, and vice versa. And also meaningfulness to that community. So we don't need to go changing every sign. It might be that there's a couple key signs. And also the ability for it to work with the infrastructure we have.
Great.
So those would be criteria we would use.
Those are the sorts of things that would also be brought up during that budget deliberation.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you very much.
Just on that one point, what Councillor Krauser was just talking about specifically, I was at the Truth Reconciliation Summit at the Banff Centre, and it was really moving, emotional day. But the Mayor of Wetaskiwin was there and was noted for the amount of work or the ways that Wetaskiwin had reached out to the Hobbema Nation close to them. And I talked with him afterwards, and he was talking about how they did very simple things. And one example was adding into the Welcome to Wetaskiwin sign said Welcome to Wetaskiwin in the First Nations language. And that's stuck in my mind ever since. It's such a simple thing we could do. I've talked with a couple of the elders about that, and it is the sort of thing that they would greatly appreciate. In your Action 14 that Councillor Krauser brought up, it's one of the bullet points, translating signage, welcome streets, parks into Stoney where appropriate. I would hope to, it's such a simple thing that I'm going to suggest, not tonight, but if I have the opportunity after the election to move that specific item up to sooner than 2019. Just letting you know.
Thank you.
Because it's such a simple thing and it will mean a lot. Councillor Stanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Oh, thank you for preparing this report. It's very complete and interesting. There's a lot of really interesting ideas in here. And I noticed that all the budget requests will be 2019 and beyond. Now, is there any kind of, we've just celebrated Canada 150. Is there anything on the horizon that might be sort of an opportunity for us in granting or in commemoration? Is there we might be thinking about that, that if we're going to be looking for budget, there might be some ways to get it through channels that are available to us because we're doing commemorations or celebrations across the country. I don't know. Yeah,
no, it's a great suggestion. Certainly we're always looking for a grant and other additional funding opportunities.
Because we certainly leveraged a lot of the Canada 150 funding in the community, right, to have some really great legacies. So I guess if there was a future funding request, it would be really good to look at the opportunities.
Absolutely, we will. And I do think that through the Canada 150, especially through the mural project, which were the 5 murals from Lake Louise to Morley, and the partnerships and the relationships that were created there have generated a good bit of momentum towards these initiatives and I think other partnership and potential funding opportunities. So we'll continue to try to grow that.
Great.
Yeah.
Nice work, thank you.
Are there other questions, discussion? Seeing none, thank you again for the work that you and Ms. Brown and many others in town staff have done. This is really meaningful work, and we can reach out and rebuild the relationship with Stoney Nakoda in simple ways, and that's been proving successful over the last couple of years. We've done some great things and renewed our friendship with the Stoney Nakoda neighbors, so this is great. Thank you. With that, I'll move the council accept the Town of Canmore commitments to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action for planning purposes. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Oh, darn, we're past 9. I'm going to slip this one in without a motion to extend. Item G6, Ms. Hyde.
Mayor and Council, this is your last decision. Happy to beat me. This is pretty straightforward. I think it was Councillor Sanford. You suggested maybe the Origins at Spring Creek would be a nice place to hold an institutional vote, and I phoned them and they were delighted. They think they might have about 100 voters there that might take advantage of the institutional vote. So I hope that you will vote in favor of allowing us to hold a vote there.
Great, thanks for that brief report. I'm sure there's no questions.
Huh?
So I will move that the council designate Origin at Spring Creek, 808 Spring Creek Drive as an institutional voting station. Discussion. Seeing none, call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously, and I'll move council be adjourned for the last time this term. What? Oh.
Parting remarks before you make that motion.
Oh, Councillor Krausert, sorry.
Yeah, before you make that motion, I just wanted to say something that I think that all of us probably feel, that it's an absolute privilege to be able to sit in these seats and represent our constituents. And I certainly have appreciated, while all of you are wondering whether you'll be back, I know I'm not going to be back for this next term anyway. And so I just wanted to say that. And I also think that you don't need to have as many of these with me not around, because it's going to save a whole lot of printing costs. Thank you.
I will thank you for your tireless and well-appreciated efforts over the last 5 years, isn't it?
5.5, yep.
5.5. You've been an excellent councillor, and the town and residents will miss your voice here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your efforts. And with that, I will move the council be adjourned. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried.